Britain and France have agreed to work with Ukraine on halting hostilities in the country's three-year full-scale war with Russia.
Einen Deal über die Ukraine zu machen, das wird Sie nicht überraschen, wenn ich das sage. Das ist sowohl für die Ukraine inakzeptabel als auch für Europa.
Wir müssen unsere deutsche Unterstützung für die Ukraine noch einmal ausbauen. Und zwar unverzüglich.
Turkey has always supported Ukraine politically and militarily.
Ukraine's largest neighbor on its western border is Poland.
The country needs to prepare for an all-out war, even as the country is strengthening the number of troops on its border with Russia.
Ukraine is absolutely extremely important for Poland. It's extremely important for region with global implications.
You're gambling with World War III. You don't have the cards right now. You're not winning. You're not winning this.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting?
We gave you, through this stupid president, $350 billion. Could you take on Russia by yourselves?
Well, you have full backing across the United Kingdom. And we stand with you, with Ukraine, for as long as it may take.
Europe is in a state of emergency in search of peace. Military and general aid to Ukraine, general security actions against Russia, and comprehensive defence plans. The whole world is now focused on the decisions coming from the European Union. The failure of the Trump-Zelensky meeting in Washington has deepened the uncertainty in the Ukraine war, exacerbating global tensions and concerns in Europe. Europe must now define a common strategy to ensure its own security and maintain its support for Ukraine. At such a sensitive time, Europe's major powers are meeting in London for an emergency summit. The deployment of troops by NATO member states in Ukraine has always been frightening for Russia. It has become a sensitive issue that comes up regularly. The conflict in Ukraine has been raging for almost 3 years now. The two countries have become very prominent on this sensitive issue.
President Emmanuel Macron says France will send fighter jets to Kyiv and train thousands of soldiers to help the country repel Russia's invasion.
Ont lancé une nouvelle coopération et annoncé la cession de Mirage 2000-5, qui sont des avions de combat français qui permettront à l'Ukraine.
Ukraine needs all the help it can get in nearly 3 years of war. The Eastern Bloc, Western Europe, the US, the EU, NATO, and many other countries and international organisations are making serious efforts for this. Ukraine's President Zelensky recently held a historic summit with US President Donald Trump. The meeting between Zelensky and Trump, initially aimed at finalising an agreement granting the US access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals, turned into a heated debate. Ukraine did not get a clear result from the meeting with the US in Washington. This has galvanised the EU, particularly the UK, France and Germany. Countries such as the UK, France and Germany have declared that they stand by Ukraine and will continue to support it. In fact, by the time these statements were published, Zelensky had already turned his route to the UK after the US. The Ukrainian leader cancelled all his activities in the US and made his way to the kingdom. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer warmly welcomed Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky and invited him to the meeting. Mr. Starmer's positive attitude towards Zelensky after the tough meeting in the US attracted all the attention. Keir Starmer talked about a summit of EU leaders and expressed his happiness that Zelensky was in the UK. This was the beginning of a summit in London that left its mark on history. Now we will take a look at what the outcome of this summit was and what the EU's position will be in the peace process of the war between Ukraine and Russia. But first, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay informed about our content. All this is completely free of charge. Let's take a look at what the EU side decided at that important summit in the UK, which Zelensky was eagerly awaiting. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer hosted the meeting at Lancaster House, a 200-year-old mansion near Buckingham Palace. Leaders from Germany, Denmark, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Spain, Canada, Finland, Sweden, the Czech Republic and Romania attended the summit. The Turkish Foreign Minister, NATO Secretary-General, the Presidents of the European Commission and the Council of Europe also attended the meeting. Keir Starmer told the leaders, who gathered on Sunday for a summit on the war in Ukraine, that they must continue to support Kiev and meet in a once-in-a-generation moment for Europe's security. Speaking at the opening of the meeting, Mr. Starmer said that Russia continues its relentless aggression even as it talks of peace, flanked by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and French President Emmanuel Macron. Mr. Starmer emphasized that the three agreed to work on a plan to stop the war and take it to the United States, which has discussed brokering a peace deal. Starmer said he was focused on being a bridge to restart peace talks and used his collapse as an opportunity to re-engage with Trump, Zelensky and Macron, rather than ramp up the rhetoric. The London meeting took on greater importance to defend and support the war-torn ally. Sunday's summit is likely to include talks on the establishment of a European military force to be sent to Ukraine to support a ceasefire. Starmer suggests this would involve a coalition of the willing. He also wants the US to re-engage, saying the UK Prime Minister does not trust Russian President Vladimir Putin, but trusts Trump. Starmer believes that there are intense discussions to get security guarantees from the US. According to Keir Starmer, if there is to be an agreement, if there is to be a cessation of hostilities, then it must be defended, because the worst outcome is a temporary pause, and then Russian President Vladimir Putin comes back. The Prime Minister of the UK said that this has happened in the past, that he thinks it is a real risk, and that is why, if there is an agreement, they have to make sure that it is a permanent agreement, not a temporary pause. Mr. Starmer listed 3 key elements for a successful peace deal. These include arming the Ukrainians to put them in a position of strength, including a European element to guarantee security, and providing a US backstop to prevent Putin from breaking his promises. Keir Starmer says all 3 pieces need to be in place, and he is working hard to put it together. The UK's recent $2.8 billion aid package to Ukraine could be used for the armaments mission in the plan. After this meeting hosted by Mr. Starmer, Zelensky has received broad support from European leaders, including this important aid. Large-scale financial support was also discussed after the meeting. Some €200 billion in seized Russian assets are on the agenda for Ukraine. Since the immediate goal of the meetings in London is to keep Ukraine at war so that it can negotiate from a position of maximum power, this amount seems to be enough to fulfill these goals for a certain period of time. With the summit organised by UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Ukraine may have gained a number of advantages, including this huge budget. Apart from the UK, there were also EU countries that gave Zelensky a lot of support. One of these countries was Germany, as we mentioned. After the Ukrainian president's visit to the UK, very important statements were shared from the Berlin side. Germany presented a surprise aid package for Ukraine. Following the escalation of tensions between Kiev and Washington, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock stated that the additional €3 billion of aid that the Berlin government will provide to Ukraine should be sent urgently. Baerbock's call for aid follows an unprecedented meeting on February 28th, when US President Donald Trump, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and US Vice President J.D. Vance clashed in the Oval Office. Annalena Baerbock also called on Germany to immediately rebuild its support for Ukraine. As a second necessary step, the German minister called for the EU summit on March 6th to approve a comprehensive financial aid package for Kiev, including humanitarian, economic, and military assistance. Baerbock also called on Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Poland to agree to supply Ukraine with long-range weapons. The minister believes that these steps will help Ukraine continue to resist Russian aggression, despite the announced or potential cancellation of US aid, and will guarantee a just peace rather than surrender. These statements signalled a rekindling of Germany's impeccable support for Ukraine. In fact, Germany has been one of the leading countries, along with the United Kingdom and France, not only in terms of support, but also in terms of sending troops to Ukraine. If you remember, the German foreign minister said that his government was open to the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine in case of a peace agreement. It is expected that Germany's latest plan to send troops to Ukraine will be much more intense in the wake of this situation. European countries also support Germany's plan to send troops to Ukraine and to wage a joint war with NATO. France, in particular, was one of the leading actors in sending troops to Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron initiated the debate on sending troops to Ukraine at a meeting of Kiev's allies in Paris in February, which was strongly opposed by some European countries. In fact, Germany was among them. Following the visit of UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer to France for the commemorations of November 11th, the idea of sending troops to Ukraine has been revived. The UK and France were in discussions to cooperate on sending troops to defence Ukraine in order to create a hard core of allies in Europe, with a particular focus on Ukraine and wider European security. This was in line with statements made by French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot during his visit to London. When asked about the possibility of sending French troops to the field, Paris and London's cooperation in this way is to be congratulated, while urging Western allies not to define or express red lines in their support for Ukraine. The French Ministry of the Armed Forces and the Élysée Palace have not yet given the green light to the deployment of conventional troops or private contractors. But for several months, such proposals have clearly been on the table. One of them concerns Défense Conseil International, the Ministry of the Armed Forces' main operator for monitoring French arms export contracts and transferring relevant military know-how. Défense Conseil International is 55% owned by the French state. Défense Conseil, 80% of which is made up of former military personnel, will be ready to continue training Ukrainian soldiers in Ukraine, as it is already doing in France and Poland. If necessary, this council could also protect French military equipment sent to Kiev. To this end, Babcock International, already present in Ukraine, has approached the Défense Conseil to share Ukraine's local facilities. These proposals from the West, however, have been a great source of inspiration for Turkey, which has said that it will align itself with the United States and make every effort to end the war between Ukraine and Russia. The government in Ankara made the move that Russian President Vladimir Putin had least expected, and followed up on the idea last mentioned by the UK and France to end the war. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced that he would mobilize a peacekeeping mission after recent meetings with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Erdogan shocked the world by announcing that he might send peacekeepers to Ukraine. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan reiterated Ankara's commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, which he said were non-negotiable. Speaking at a press conference in Ankara after his meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, in Erdogan's words, Crimea should be fully Ukraine's, and the necessary steps should be taken to achieve this. And the way to achieve this is through the Black Sea. Therefore, if Turkish leader Erdogan wants to prepare the ground for the return of Crimea to the Ukrainians, he needs to strengthen Kiev's navy. In its annual report for 2024, Babcock announced that work was underway to create a technical support site in Ukraine, including the repair and overhaul of military vehicles. American contractors could now operate openly in Ukraine and maintain military equipment sent to Kiev from American or Allied stocks, such as F-16s and Patriot air defense systems. Now France, with the support of the UK, is considering protecting and maintaining French weapons in Ukraine for the same purpose. Within the French armed forces, especially the army, there is less and less reticence about the role that the country's military personnel can play in Ukraine, especially after the end of hostilities. The Chief of Staff of the Army, General Pierre Schill, has confirmed the possibility of these security guarantees offered by a NATO coalition or by special purpose coalitions, and therefore of some kind of French contribution. In the same way, the UK wing is working very hard with its army. The UK, together with its military wing, has admitted to helping the Ukrainians to develop their own weapons. In response to a question from an MP, Starmer emphasised that they had made their own contribution without elaborating. According to analysts, the UK's assistance was specifically related to the development of long-range drones, which have been striking Russia for several months, creating serious difficulties for Moscow. This assistance is a sensitive area for the Allies, who have been pushing the limits of joint warfare since the start of the war. The UK has had a large number of military advisors in Ukraine since 2014, a fact that has not gone unnoticed by the Russians. Russia's ambassador to the UK, Andrei Kelin, has suggested that the UK is now directly involved in this war. Andrei Kelin was probably referring to the use of Storm Shadow missiles in attacks on Russia. With such accusations, the question of the aftermath is becoming more and more acute in a context where Europeans are being forced to become more and more involved in the conflict. According to Elie Tenenbaum, a researcher at the French Institute of International Relations, it may not be easy for the Europeans to send contractors to Ukraine, as the Americans did, if only for insurance and financial reasons, but they can envisage other models. According to him, in the event of a ceasefire agreement, it would be technically possible to send conventional troops to Ukraine to guarantee the country's security and Russia's compliance with the ceasefire. These troops would be deployed in eastern Ukraine, backed by an as-yet undefined air and naval protection system, and not by NATO's Article 5, which obliges the alliance countries to retaliate in the event of an attack. Elie Tenenbaum's plan enjoys great support in France. The German side confirms all such support for Ukraine and claims to be on board. At the same time as the Berlin government is supporting the EU's efforts, it is also doing critical work to develop its own national military industry. According to the Germans, more deterrent military dynamics are needed to stop the Russians. To this end, Germany is forging solid partnerships with leading global defence suppliers, particularly evident in artillery development, where efforts are particularly intense. Recently exhibited at Eurosatory, Rheinmetall presented GMARS, an MLRS developed in collaboration with Lockheed Martin, which outperforms the American HIMARS. Indeed, German industrial capacity in terms of defence is the envy of the world. In addition to artillery systems, this process also includes armoured vehicles. Germany is arguably at the forefront of armoured vehicle production. German armoured vehicles excel in protection, mobility and efficiency. German armoured vehicles are also heavily armoured and provide exceptional protection, while their tracked systems have proven time and again to be of critical importance, demonstrating superior tactical mobility. Their advanced automation technology further increases their efficiency, providing unmatched performance. Despite criticism about their weight and cost, these features are essential trade-offs for the superior protection they offer. German industries report that none of the 16 PH-2000 systems supplied to Ukraine have been lost, making it one of the most powerful artillery systems. However, it is important to recognise that these sophisticated systems are designed for advanced military forces. Given the maintenance demands and the expertise required for operation, quality inevitably comes at a price. Indeed, the proven successes of German armoured vehicles in Ukraine have led some commentators in other countries to strongly recommend the production of German tanks for national defence needs. For example, the UK mainland has too many main battle tanks and insufficient production infrastructure. Many commentators therefore see the Leopard 2 produced by KNDS as the perfect solution. While the second round of talks between the United States and Russia was eagerly awaited, on the other front, the European Union was making preparations for a possible peace situation. The EU wing convened the leaders of the member states and adopted the 16th sanctions package against Russia. The aim was to end the war as soon as possible by restricting Russia economically. In addition to sanctions against Russia, the United Kingdom and France reconsidered the idea of sending troops to Ukraine. These proposals from the West, however, have been a great source of inspiration for Turkey, which has said that it will align itself with the United States and make every effort to end the war between Ukraine and Russia. The government in Ankara made the move that Russian President Vladimir Putin had least expected, and followed up on the idea last mentioned by the UK and France to end the war. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced that he would mobilize a peacekeeping mission after recent meetings with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Erdogan shocked the world by announcing that he might send peacekeepers to Ukraine.
olan kuvvetli desteğini ifade ettim. Aynı zamanda müzakere sürecinin kalıcı bir barışla sonuçlandırılması için her türlü desteği vereceğimizin altını çizdim. Avrupa Birliği'nin ve birliğe yön veren ülkelerin yanlışta ısrar etmekten vazgeçmesi gerekiyor.
But Turkey may join a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine as part of Trump's ceasefire efforts with Putin. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan raised this possibility in separate meetings in Ankara with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Most recently, after talks between the US and Russian delegations in Istanbul, Erdogan shocked even the EU with his decision. Erdogan's dramatic decision to deploy troops put Turkey in a critical position, potentially easing the burden on European allies such as the United Kingdom and France, who are planning a European-led mission to Ukraine. Already, President Erdogan has maintained strong ties with both Ukraine and Russia and played a key role in negotiating the now defunct Black Sea Grain Agreement. Now, with the troop deployment plan, we can see Turkey as a much deeper actor on the ground. Of course, Turkey has conditions. The Ankara government has announced that it will not implement the troop deployment plan unless it is part of such an agreement. But if the conditions are met, there will be no obstacle to this. The Ukrainian and US sides seem quite happy with this decision. In fact, Ukrainian officials are already sharing information about Turkey's ability to carry out important activities in this regard. A Ukrainian official close to the talks confirmed Turkey's support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, suggesting that Ankara could provide credible and enforceable peace and security guarantees. But when the EU stands together, under the same roof, the shortcomings gradually disappear and the result is a formidable force. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer proved this with his recent summit. Now the EU has a peace plan to present to the US. The main agenda of the United Kingdom-led summit is the continuation of military support to Ukraine and a final end to the war. Just one day before this summit, United Kingdom Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met urgently. As a result of the Starmer-Zelensky meeting, the United Kingdom announced that it would provide Ukraine with $2.8 billion in support.
Today, we're going to sign the UK-Ukrainian Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loan Agreement. And of course, this is in addition to the £3 billion a year ongoing support from the United Kingdom to Ukraine.
We already know that the United Kingdom has decided to send troops and Typhoon jets to Ukraine. With these moves, the United Kingdom is almost challenging Moscow. What impact will these global developments have on European security and balances? As the cards are being redistributed on the world stage, how will London's support for Ukraine change the balance? For answers to our questions and more, our video begins. But first of all, please do not forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. Let us get started. The United Kingdom has reached an agreement with Kiev to provide Ukraine with a $2.84 billion loan backed by frozen Russian assets. The loan, under the Group of Seven's Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Lending Initiative, was signed during Zelensky's visit to London to meet with Keir Starmer. Starmer told reporters at a press conference with Zelensky that the Group of Seven stands by Ukraine.
You have full backing across the United Kingdom. And we stand with you, with Ukraine, for as long as it may take.
United Kingdom Finance Minister Rachel Reeves and Ukrainian Finance Minister Serhiy Marchenko will sign the United Kingdom-Ukraine bilateral agreement. Serhiy Marchenko said that the United Kingdom continues to defend Ukraine. Today's agreement, which contributes to strengthening Ukraine's defence capabilities, confirms this. The loan will be used to purchase defence equipment that suits Ukraine's needs, the Finance Ministry said. The £2.26 billion loan will strengthen Ukraine's military capability and will be repaid using profits from sanctioned Russian sovereign assets. The loan demonstrates the United Kingdom's commitment to Ukraine's defence. A strong Ukraine is vital to United Kingdom national security. The entire loan will be used for military purchases to strengthen Ukraine's defences, with the first tranche expected to be disbursed to Ukraine next week. Russia's obligation under international law to pay for the damage it has done to Ukraine is clear, and this Group of Seven agreement, backed by profits from Russian state assets subject to sanctions, is an important step toward ensuring that this happens. The funding will be provided in 3 equal annual payments of £752 million. The announcement of the loan agreement is in addition to the United Kingdom's commitment to provide military assistance to Ukraine, a commitment of £3 billion per year. The loan follows the Prime Minister's government's commitment to increase United Kingdom defence spending to 2.5% of gross domestic product by 2027. And, if economic and fiscal conditions permit, to increase defence spending to 3% of gross domestic product in the next Parliament. In addition to this financial support, the Starmer administration has opened the door to military and arms support. In January, Zelensky and Starmer signed a 100-year partnership agreement during their meeting in Kiev on January 16. The comprehensive agreement covers cooperation in the military, energy, scientific, cultural, economic, and other sectors. There has also been talk for months about sending British Typhoon fighter jets to Ukraine and sending more than 10,000 peacekeepers to Ukraine. United Kingdom Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that he is ready and willing to deploy British troops to Ukraine to enforce any peace agreement. Starmer said that any role in helping to guarantee the security of Ukraine helps to guarantee the security of our continent and this country. This was the first time Mr. Starmer has openly said he is willing to send British troops to Ukraine. When French President Emmanuel Macron first raised the possibility of sending Western peacekeepers to Ukraine last year, the idea was rejected by other allies. But it has gained momentum in recent months, especially before Mr. Trump's inauguration. On the other hand, the United Kingdom is open to handing over Typhoons to the Ukrainian Air Force, but this would require a long-term plan, including pilot training, logistical infrastructure, and parts procurement. If the United Kingdom gives the green light, we are capable of adapting our pilots in a short time, Kiev said. Having Typhoon jets flying over Ukraine could provide a much more effective defence and perhaps offensive capability against Russian air forces. Of course, there is also the risk of a major escalation between NATO and Russia. However, the United Kingdom seems to be closer to saying, let us give Typhoons if necessary, or at least start a pilot training process, rather than taking a hesitant stance as in the should we give F-35 or not debates coming from the United States. Russia, on the other hand, characterises Britain's moves as aggression. According to statements from Moscow, the Kremlin considers London's allocation of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine a clear violation of international law. Likewise, talk of the possibility of the United Kingdom sending troops to Ukraine has led the Russian press to comment that London is playing with fire. Although London has not officially confirmed an all-out deployment of troops to Ukraine, it appears to be determined to deploy trainers, advisors, and special operations units. This would not mean a direct war with Russia, but we would de facto support Ukraine's defence capability. Starmer's government says. The United Kingdom is also trying to take the initiative on the diplomatic front by hosting a leaders' summit on Ukraine. The summit rounds off a busy week of diplomacy for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is increasing United Kingdom defence spending and has travelled to Washington, D.C. for productive talks with President Trump to support United Kingdom and European security. The Prime Minister met again with both President Trump and President Zelensky following the events at the President's meeting in Washington, D.C. This morning, the Prime Minister welcomed Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni to Downing Street and then appeared at the summit in central London. The leaders of Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Spain, Finland, Sweden, the Czech Republic and Romania are also attending the summit. It is also known that the Turkish Foreign Minister will be present at the summit. The British Prime Minister has also invited the Secretary-General of NATO, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and European Council President Antonio Costa, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will meet the leaders later in the summit. This summit of European leaders is of great importance for peace in Ukraine. European leaders are set to prioritise military support and increased economic pressure on Russia to strengthen Ukraine's position. Talks will also focus on securing a lasting peace deal, ensuring Ukraine can deter future Russian aggression, and planning for robust security guarantees. Sir Keir Starmer announced that he will present a peace plan to United States President Donald Trump after a summit of European leaders in London. Sir Keir said that his recent meetings with Zelensky, France's Macron and Trump had led to an agreement that the United Kingdom would work with Paris and possibly one or two other countries to work with Kiev to draw up a plan to stop the fighting. The British Prime Minister added that the plan would then be discussed with the United States. Concrete declarations of support at the London summit are keeping all eyes on the situation. United Kingdom Prime Minister Keir Starmer was very clear. The whole of the United Kingdom stands with Ukraine. Many other European leaders have also pledged their support for the Ukrainian people. But the meeting in London later today will be a critical time because they need to make concrete steps, plans, and announcements on how they will support Ukraine. This is no longer the case. Europe really needs to act, at least that is the feeling in Ukraine. But does it still make sense to refuse to choose between Washington, Europe, and Kiev when the United States, the guarantor of the Western security apparatus for 80 years, now looks like an unreliable partner? British pundits and political leaders, including the most Atlanticist ones, are increasingly convinced that the Western camp is falling apart. Gordon Brown's Foreign Secretary said that the idea of the West is not dead, but in its current form, it is in intensive care. Peter Ricketts, David Cameron's former National Security Advisor, says Starmer should give up his ambition to be a bridge to the United States. He thinks it is an old British mentality, but he does not think it is helpful. The challenge facing the West is daunting, but the alliance has endured strong doubts before, and there are strong arguments on both sides of the Atlantic that could save the alliance and support a strong United States presence and engagement in Europe. And Europe itself can do a lot to show why the United States is much stronger than it would be without it. In the early 1990s, there were voices advocating the gradual disintegration of NATO after the end of the Warsaw Pact. But since Russia has been on the path of revisionism for the last 2 decades, NATO has not only survived, it has continued to grow. And it has become stronger in terms of cohesion, membership, and deterrent power. The Trump administration has created a fundamental trust issue. For the first time, European leaders are unsure whether the United States remains committed to NATO and to the American leadership role in NATO. But the story is more complex. It is crucial to remember that Trump plays a vital role in Ukraine's defense. Ukraine was able to fend off a full-scale Russian invasion in February 2022 and survive because the United States had begun supplying Ukraine with lethal weapons like Javelin anti-tank missiles during Trump's first term. Without the Javelins, Russian forces would have been able to capture Kiev in a matter of days, as originally planned. It is therefore not too far-fetched to argue that Ukraine owes a significant part of its survival in the critical days of early spring 2022 to the support of the former Trump White House. Why would Washington now want to abandon this remarkable success story? A story of United States-Ukrainian determination and resolve to defend and promote the sovereign rights of a free country. The United States also understands the dangers of abandoning Europe to deal with Russia. After Russia's annexation of Crimea and occupation of eastern Ukraine in 2014, Washington decided to leave the confrontation with Moscow largely to the Europeans. The main instruments for this were the so-called Minsk process, the talks aimed at a solution for eastern Ukraine, and the Normandy Four, the contact group of France, Germany, Russia and Ukraine that met between 2014 and 2022. Unfortunately, the Minsk and Normandy process failed, and an American leadership vacuum encouraged the Russian side to escalate further, culminating in the invasion in February 2022. Neither the first Trump administration nor the Biden administration repeated the mistake made by the Obama White House in 2014. They did not leave the resolution of the Ukrainian war to the Europeans, but instead decided to lead a remarkable international effort to support Ukraine. The new Trump administration has decided to play a leading role again, this time to end the war after 11 years of conflict and annexation and 3 years of brutal full-scale occupation. In principle, it is in Europe's own interest to welcome this strategic United States engagement, which in fact stands in the way of a larger Washington shift away from Europe and toward China. But to succeed, the two sides of the Atlantic must quickly bridge the trust gap. If this can be done, the critical challenge is then to find a way to secure and implement a viable Ukrainian agreement. Above all, Ukraine will need to participate and make sure that the outcome is fair and not a sellout. Without the active involvement of Ukraine and Europe, the Trump administration's peace effort could fizzle out before it has even begun in earnest. It is therefore in the United States' interest to quickly make peace with Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership after the White House confrontation on February 28. Is the United States still Europe's power? Behind the tensions between Washington and Kiev lies Europe's role in the security equation. The United States' military presence in Europe has strengthened in recent years, but it is far from equal to the hundreds of thousands of Russian troops in Ukraine and in Russia's western military districts. And Washington has firmly rejected United States boots on the ground in Ukraine. That is why the Trump administration needs European partners, and it has made this clear by asking European powers to secure or enforce a possible Ukraine deal. In return, the Europeans must be determined enough to confront Washington with its own requirements. Adapting the American Revolutionary War slogan, "No taxation without representation," they should make it clear that there will be no military deployment without participation in peace talks. And Europe knows one thing. The deal, if it happens, is not just about dividing Ukraine or securing a quick ceasefire. It is about a lasting and secure peace arrangement, about existential security challenges for all of Europe. An even bigger question is how to deal with Russia. So far, there have been no meaningful signals from Moscow about possible concessions. Predictably, the Kremlin has made maximalist demands and will find it very difficult to make concessions. It is an illusion to believe that a lasting peace with Russia will break out only by sanctifying the line of contact in eastern Ukraine. Russia will come up with new, complex and far-reaching demands with strategic stability issues in relation to United States military installations in Eastern Europe, making it an expensive and unreliable partner. Europe and the United States should prepare themselves for a long and painful process. Above all, there is an urgent need for a new kind of European leadership. To defend strategic security interests and rebuild the frayed alliance, European powers must show that they can shoulder a more significant burden that increases the alliance's collective strength. France, Germany, Poland, and other like-minded neighbours should launch a major defence initiative centred around a core group of powers ready to speak with one voice on security issues. This European Defence Union would agree on majority decision-making, with as close participation as possible from the United Kingdom. Key objectives would include the creation of a consolidated and unified defence market and supply chain, joint development, procurement, and maintenance of military equipment, and joint training of military personnel. As nuclear powers, France and the United Kingdom will be encouraged to examine options for increasing the EDU contribution to extended deterrence. The best and most elegant way for the Trump administration to engage both Europe and Ukraine in the peace agreement would be to re-establish the tried-and-true contact group format introduced under United States leadership in the 1990s to create unity and a sense of common purpose. We can remind Washington that it should be proud of this innovative and successful diplomatic format. It is a United States invention. In Ukraine, it can provide the critical ingredients needed to ensure that the war actually ends. 30 years ago, diplomat Richard Holbrooke wrote an article entitled "America, a European Power." Holbrooke predicted that Europe in the 21st century will still need the active American engagement that has been a necessary component of continental balance for half a century. The article ends with a prophetic assertion. The task ahead is as daunting as it is necessary. To walk away from this challenge will only mean paying a higher price later on. Yes, Europe needs the United States to permanently end the war in Ukraine. but the United States will need Europe to successfully accomplish this task. We hope the Trump White House recognizes this reality. Thank you for following us. There are currently two different efforts to end the war between Ukraine and Russia. One is the meeting between the US and Russian delegation in Riyadh.
U.S. and Russian officials in Saudi Arabia meeting right now with a Russian delegation led by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
The other is the critical summit in Ankara between Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky and Turkish President Erdogan.
Welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you.
The immediate outcome of the talks in Riyadh is that the EU should join the peace process and even ease sanctions against Russia. It was also decided in Riyadh that Trump and Putin would meet in the near future. In Ankara, the capital of Turkey, there was a reaction that no one expected. President Erdogan stated that Ukraine's territorial integrity must be preserved and the Donbass region, including Crimea, must remain under Kiev's control. For the first time, Erdogan's statements were a very clear message to Putin. The Donbass region is rich in minerals and natural resources, which the Russian leader dreams of. It is no secret that Putin wants to annex this region to Russia in exchange for 3 years of war. However, Erdogan has loudly warned against Putin's plan from Ankara and opposed Ukraine becoming a colonial state. If the Turkish leader's warning is not heeded, it is likely that the Ankara government will continue to support Ukraine, albeit on its own. So far, this is the first time that Erdogan and Putin have confronted each other so sharply. In Riyadh, the US side discussed military aid to Ukraine after meeting with the Russian delegation. The White House announced that they would continue this aid in exchange for 50% of Ukraine's natural resources. Trump has previously said that he would like Ukraine to repay US support by giving Washington access to the country's vast but unexplored rare earth minerals. However, the Ukrainian president was not keen on this proposal and flatly rejected it. The White House, for its part, criticized Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's refusal to sign an agreement that would give the United States access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals, calling it short-sighted. So how could Zelensky potentially turn down military aid from the United States in one fell swoop? Did the Ukrainian leader's refusal have anything to do with the summit in Turkey? Could Erdogan's supportive messages to Ukraine have empowered Zelensky in this regard? Now, we will discover the answers to these critical questions together. We will explore what Turkey can do for Ukraine in the future. What agreements were signed between Erdogan and Zelensky after this critical summit? And what approaches the EU and the US will adopt to this rapprochement between Turkey and Ukraine? But first of all, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay informed about our content. All this is completely free of charge. Now let's get started. First of all, let's dive into this strategic process that started with Erdogan's unexpected hosting of Zelensky. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan reiterated Ankara's commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, which he said were non-negotiable. Speaking at a press conference in Ankara after his meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, Erdogan also emphasized that US President Donald Trump's peace move is in line with Turkey's policy since the full-scale war began 3 years ago. Erdogan said Turkey could be a good address for possible peace talks that could include Russia. He was referring to Turkey as an ideal host for possible peace talks on Russia's war against Ukraine, and could offer Ankara a platform for future negotiations. Erdogan also pointed to Turkey's previous mediation efforts, including the Black Sea Grain Agreement, which allows Ukraine's agricultural exports until Russia's withdrawal in 2023. The Turkish leader also focused on the fact that economic ties between the two countries would increase dramatically after this important summit. After the talks, it was reported that Ukraine aims to increase its trade volume with Turkey to $10 billion. Ukraine's first Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Economy, Yulia Sviridenko, summarized this more clearly in her statement after her meeting with Turkish Trade Minister Ömer Bolat. Sviridenko confirmed that Kiev and Ankara are interested in expanding bilateral trade and aim to increase bilateral trade from 6.2 billion to 10 billion in 2024. Exports from Ukraine to Turkey fell 6.8% year-on-year to 2.21 billion in 2021, while imports from Turkey fell 10.2% to $4.24 billion, the State Statistics Service reported. Turkey accounted for 5.3% of Ukraine's merchandise exports and 6.0% of its imports last year. The summit is likely to create an incredible economic network between the two countries. Turkish President Erdogan also emphasized that the dynamics will continue in a positive direction, sending messages that these planned economic relations with Ukraine will benefit both sides. Erdogan's remarks came after US and Russian delegations held preliminary talks in Saudi Arabia on a range of issues, including Ukraine. Erdogan was demonstrating both his support for Ukrainian sovereignty and that Turkey was not at odds with the United States on this issue. Moreover, another conclusion to be drawn from all these assessments that Erdogan made at the summit is that if Putin rejects the peace proposal put forward by Erdogan, Turkey will be more intensely involved in the process. When the question arises as to how Turkey can be more intensively involved in this process, the answer is the country's land, sea and air power capabilities, potential and military assets. Due to its geostrategic structure, Turkey can actually block Russia very easily in the Black Sea. Already since the beginning of the war, the Ankara government has not allowed Russian warships to pass through the Istanbul and Dardanelles Straits. Turkey derives this right to block them from the Montreux Convention on the Straits. Turkey has the power to end the war not only through its decision to prevent Russian warships from passing through the Straits, but also through its naval support for Ukraine. The sending of the Hetman Ivan Mazepa corvette to Ukraine has already proved the Ankara government's support for Kiev. Now we may witness more Turkish naval support for Ukraine. In Erdogan's words, Crimea should be fully Ukraine's, and the necessary steps should be taken to achieve this. And the way to achieve this is through the Black Sea. Therefore, if Turkish leader Erdogan wants to prepare the ground for the return of Crimea to the Ukrainians, he needs to strengthen Kiev's navy. Another possibility is Turkey's tariff on General Khalifa Haftar in Libya. Haftar, who was backed by Russia, was defeated by Turkish drones, troops and navy ships transported to Libya by Ankara. The US side met with the Russian delegation in Riyadh. There were important details in these talks that raised hopes for an end to the war between the two countries. Senior diplomats from both countries reported that the talks marked an extraordinary turn in foreign policy under US President Donald Trump. Steve Witkoff, US President Donald Trump's special envoy, said in a statement that the US is very close to reaching a peace agreement that will end the war between Ukraine and Russia.
And President Putin was very, very flexible in his thinking, released him, and I think it was a huge signal to President Trump that he wants to get a deal done.
By pointing to the so-called Istanbul Protocol Agreement, Steve Witkoff emphasized Turkey's strategic role in the peace process of the war between Ukraine and Russia. While the second round of talks between the United States and Russia was eagerly awaited, on the other front, the European Union was making preparations for a possible peace situation. The EU wing convened the leaders of the member states and adopted the 16th sanctions package against Russia. The aim was to end the war as soon as possible by restricting Russia economically. In addition to sanctions against Russia, the United Kingdom and France reconsidered the idea of sending troops to Ukraine. This has been on France's agenda for a long time, but the Paris government has not talked much about sending troops to Ukraine recently. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, has brought the idea of sending troops back to the agenda and attracted all the attention. These proposals from the West, however, have been a great source of inspiration for Turkey, which has said that it will align itself with the United States and make every effort to end the war between Ukraine and Russia. The government in Ankara made the move that Russian President Vladimir Putin had least expected, and followed up on the idea last mentioned by the UK and France to end the war. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced that he would mobilize a peacekeeping mission after recent meetings with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Erdogan shocked the world by announcing that he might send peacekeepers to Ukraine. Now, we will take a closer look at this critical decision and discover the conditions under which Turkey will send peacekeepers to Ukraine and how the US and Russia will react.
Hızlığına olan kuvvetli desteğini ifade ettim. Aynı zamanda müzakere sürecinin kalıcı bir barışla sonuçlandırılması için her türlü desteği vereceğimizin altını çizdim. Avrupa Birliği'nin ve birliğe yön veren ülkelerin yanlışta ısrar etmekten vazgeçmesi gerekiyor.
But first, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. Let's get started. Turkey may join a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine as part of Trump's ceasefire efforts with Putin. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan raised this possibility in separate meetings in Ankara with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Most recently, after talks between the US and Russian delegations in Istanbul, Erdogan shocked even the EU with his decision. Erdogan's dramatic decision to deploy troops put Turkey in a critical position, potentially easing the burden on European allies such as the United Kingdom and France, who are planning a European-led mission to Ukraine. Already, President Erdogan has maintained strong ties with both Ukraine and Russia and played a key role in negotiating the now defunct Black Sea Grain Agreement. Now, with the troop deployment plan, we can see Turkey as a much deeper actor on the ground. Of course, Turkey has conditions. The Ankara government has announced that it will not implement the troop deployment plan unless it is part of such an agreement. But if the conditions are met, there will be no obstacle to this. The Ukrainian and US sides seem quite happy with this decision. In fact, Ukrainian officials are already sharing information about Turkey's ability to carry out important activities in this regard. A Ukrainian official close to the talks confirmed Turkey's support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, suggesting that Ankara could provide credible and enforceable peace and security guarantees. While Washington supports the concept, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth suggested on February 12th that such a mission would not involve US troops and should be led by European and non-European allies. US President Donald Trump, on the other hand, said he had made Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin accept the peacekeeping plan. Even if Putin accepts this plan, assuming that there are those in the Kremlin who oppose the idea of deploying peacekeepers, Turkey's decision will come as a shock. So what kind of roles can Turkey, which has taken this critical decision to deploy peacekeepers, play differently in the future? First of all, Turkey's geostrategic advantages, its activities so far, and its attitude towards the war are very important. The new United States administration is pushing ahead with a peace plan, but Washington, Kiev, and Moscow have different views on what peace can represent. In Kiev, expectations are cautious. Ukrainians keep repeating that no one wants peace more than they do, but they want justice after so much loss and sacrifice. Russia is willing to sit at the negotiating table, emphasizing that it will not give up the territories it has seized. If you look deeper into the facts behind Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you will see that the occupied territories are rich in industrial and natural resources. Perhaps the main objective was to plunder Ukraine's huge natural wealth. However, Trump and Zelensky's latest move is a fundamental blow to all of Putin's hidden ambitions. The United States side, on the other hand, has said that it wants negotiations to start as soon as possible, and that the Munich Security Conference will be the first step towards ending a senseless war that has caused so much loss and destruction. The 61st Munich Security Conference will be the first meeting between Ukraine and the new United States administration. But the divergence of views between the parties raises the question of what if peace cannot be achieved? If Russia does not end the war despite all attempts, can the United States and North Atlantic Treaty Organization force Vladimir Putin to make peace? For several months now, the United Kingdom, Germany and France have been discussing the creation of an army to stand up to Russia and even sending troops to Ukraine. Zelensky wants the largest peacekeeping force in history in Ukraine. On February 13, during a visit to the Khmelnytsky nuclear power plant, Ukrainian President Zelensky told reporters that Ukraine needs a peacekeeping force of 100,000 personnel. This strong, deterrent, capable, and well-equipped army could be an effective response to Vladimir Putin's aggression. But could Europe send 100,000 troops? Does the United States support this idea? How strong is the alliance's army? What kind of an impact could a show of military might have on Russia? For answers to all these critical questions and much more, the video begins. But just before we start, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. Europe is trying to figure out what role it can play beyond increasing defence spending and supplying arms to Kiev. One model under discussion is to deploy a European-led peacekeeping force to enforce a possible ceasefire. Talks about a European peacekeeping force have begun in earnest. During his visit to Kiev, United Kingdom Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that his country would play a full role in a possible peacekeeping force for Ukraine, while French President Emmanuel Macron said that Europeans should create security guarantees for Ukraine. Lithuanian Foreign Minister Kęstutis Budrys also did not rule out sending troops to Ukraine. According to two European diplomats, current negotiations focus on creating a deterrence force of up to 50,000 troops from 5 to 6 different European countries that would oversee a demarcation line between Ukrainian and Russian forces in the event of a ceasefire. According to a separate European security official, the British and French have already started some preliminary planning. The peacekeeping mission should become a guarantor of security and peace if Ukraine and the Russian Federation agree to end hostilities. The discussion of this idea is becoming increasingly important against the backdrop of talks between political leaders of different countries about the ceasefire and peace talks in Ukraine. There are currently 3 possible scenarios for the deployment of peacekeeping troops. The first scenario is the deployment of British troops along the borderline between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. British troops would patrol the area using aircraft and armoured vehicles. These troops will deploy rapid reaction forces in the rear to neutralise potential threats. The second scenario involves the creation of a defensive cordon around Kiev. But this is an unlikely scenario. It is called nuclear because it would involve large-scale troops. The last scenario involves the transfer of the British training programme for Ukrainian troops to Ukrainian territory. The transfer of the mission, according to the initiator's idea, would reduce logistical costs and speed up training. France, Poland, and other European Union countries could also be involved. These countries could be involved in joint work to control the buffer zone, air defence, training of Ukrainian troops. But officials in London and Paris are keeping the details of the talks secret. The British government's public position is that Western allies should give Zelensky as much support as possible, while Ukrainians should decide when and whether to hold peace talks. As ministers and officials wait for Trump to push Ukraine and Russia to the negotiating table in private talks, planning is underway for what happens next. One idea that is increasingly being discussed, not only in public, but also behind closed doors in Westminster, is whether Western troops should guarantee any peace terms. The idea revolves around the idea that Russia could retain the Ukrainian territory it has seized under a peace deal. But there is still a lot of uncertainty about this possibility. If that happens, European leaders are considering what can be done to protect the remaining territory of Ukraine from future Russian aggression. The difficulty is that Mr. Trump's past criticism of deploying troops abroad and his political attacks on Ukraine over financial support mean that United States troops are unlikely to participate. Many British officials say they have come to this conclusion. One idea floated by the United States is that Western troops could man an 800-mile border between Ukraine and Russia, creating a demilitarized buffer zone. Mr. Macron has floated the idea that European allies could be deployed on the ground to play such a role. British officials have stressed that they have not yet fully endorsed the proposal. But the fact that these talks are taking place shows how determined Downing Street is to continue to support Ukraine even after Mr. Trump takes office. In the spring, Sir Keir will announce a timetable for increasing the United Kingdom's defence spending from 2.3% to 2.5% of gross domestic product annually. However, It remains to be seen whether this level can be reached before 2030. Such a deployment could involve thousands of British troops, following warnings from military leaders that the United Kingdom does not have the capacity to wage a war. These additional NATO troops could create a security bubble over a significant part of Ukraine not occupied by Russia. According to analysts, this would significantly strengthen Ukraine's chances of ending the war on its own terms, and such a presence would inevitably be necessary for stabilization once the conflict ends. Zelensky studied the once secret map of Ukraine's vast deposits of rare earths, emphasizing their strategic importance. Ukraine has significant reserves of rare earth elements needed to produce high-performance magnets, electric motors, and consumer electronics. Zelensky noted that less than 20% of Ukraine's mineral resources are under Russia's control, including about half of its rare earth deposits. He warned that Russia could open these resources to allies such as North Korea and Iran. The only way to convince Russian President Vladimir Putin that Ukraine's sovereignty and independence are no longer vulnerable to his revisionist, hegemonic ambitions is seen as a concrete security guarantee, evidenced by a military presence on the ground, while a NATO mission to Ukraine and NATO membership would have the maximum effect. A strong transatlantic coalition of the willing would be sufficient and could help achieve the former. On the other hand, the European Union is trying to clamp down on Vladimir Putin by strengthening its defences. Latvia, a small country of around 2 million people sandwiched between Russia and the Baltic Sea, is one of the last countries to reintroduce conscription. The country abolished conscription in 2006, but the deteriorating security situation led to a dramatic turnaround. From January 1, 2024, Latvian men will have to register for military service from the moment they turn 18. The decision was initially met with some resistance, but the cold, hard reality of the threat to Russia's neighbours quickly changed public opinion. Norway, which already had a mandatory conscription policy, has continued to improve its defences in a changing security landscape. In April, the Norwegian government presented a long-term plan to more than double the country's defence budget and add 20,000 additional soldiers, reservists, and employees to the armed forces. Lithuania, another Baltic state that has long feared Russian aggression, reintroduced military service in 2015. Outside the Baltic states, other Nordic countries such as Finland, Sweden, and Norway have small standing armies, but have the infrastructure to mobilise large numbers of trained reservists at very short notice. This model is particularly relevant for Finland. Although the Finnish Defence Forces has only about 13,000 active members, it can mobilise about 1 million reservists, of which 280,000 can be mobilised immediately. This system reflects Finland's historical readiness to defend itself against Russian aggression, as seen in the Winter War against the Soviet Union in 1939 to 1940. In this war, Finnish forces famously fought to a standstill. The Finnish model of military service is advertised as a model for effectively combining a small professional army with a large pool of trained civilian reinforcements. This model has worked well against the Russians in the past and remains a vital part of Finland's defence strategy. The large reserve force allows for impressively short mobilisation in the event of conflict and ensures that the country's defences are robust and resilient. Germany is also reviewing its military preparedness against an increasingly hostile Russia. After decades of prioritising economic recovery and political unity at the expense of military investment, the German government has announced plans to rejuvenate its armed forces. Germany is developing plans to ensure that in the event of a war with Russia, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and vehicles can move along the main highway that runs through most of the country. This massive army would use Germany's ports, highways and railways to head eastward. The plan calls for the Western Intervention Force to be deployed within 3 to 6 months, with a large number of weapons, other equipment, and around 200,000 vehicles, many of which would arrive from Germany's North Sea ports before heading to potential battlefields in the east. The A2 motorway, which stretches some 300 miles from Oberhausen in the west to the outskirts of Berlin in the east of the country, near the Polish border, will be a vital part of this mass mobilization. There are many bridges along this route, and the plan indicates that they will be the main targets of Russian missile attacks in the event of war. Such possible counterattacks could significantly delay NATO's mobilization efforts. That is why the Germans are already carrying out significant work on contingencies, including alternative routes and temporary bridges. Additional plans are also being made to accommodate, resupply, and feed the hundreds of thousands of Allied troops passing through Germany. According to additional plans under consideration, NATO convoys will have the option to stop and rest for supplies every 300 to 500 metres. It is speculated that such a massive logistical effort could require new powers for the German Federal Police, with conscription being considered and officers potentially involved in the management of any POW camps. The civilian situation has also not been overlooked in this plan. Operation Deutschland recommends that Germany prepare for the worst-case scenario by increasing self-sufficiency through mechanisms such as diesel generators and wind turbines. The role of business is also given special attention in the plan. At the meeting in Hamburg, Lieutenant Colonel Jörn Plischke suggested that companies should train their employees in skills that could be useful in a crisis, such as truck driving, noting that 70% of Germany's truck drivers are Eastern European. Plischke said that in the event of war, these drivers might not be in the country. The Bundeswehr is also urging companies to develop contingency plans, including ensuring autonomous power supply, for example, through diesel generators. Meetings were held in Hamburg with representatives of trade, industry, and agriculture. Similar events are being organised across the country. In response to the increased risks, the Hamburg Senate has strengthened crisis management and civil defence by creating 40 additional posts. A third internal security company made up of volunteers has also been launched. Germany also conducted its first joint civil-military exercise, Red Storm Alpha, aimed at protecting port infrastructure from sabotage. In the future, a larger-scale exercise, Red Storm Bravo, is planned to cover the transportation and logistics sectors. The Bundeswehr's plans have been supported by both politicians and the business community. The leadership of the Hamburg Chamber of Commerce stated that the resilience of the economy is vital for the country's civil and military defence. Meanwhile, German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius last month proposed a new voluntary military conscription service to ensure the country is ready by 2029. What Germany is doing reflects a broader European realisation that the security environment is changing and that NATO must evolve to adapt. In strengthening collective defence, the alliance has announced its most ambitious defence plan since the Cold War. Today, more than 500,000 troops are kept at a high level of readiness, and the priority for NATO is the defence of all allies. NATO has no obligation for military service, but a third of its members still rely on some form of military service, and others are considering bringing it back amid the growing Russian threat. As NATO renews its posture against Russian aggression, other member states point to an exemplary model where full military readiness is mobilised in addition to civilian efforts. Through its military conscription system, Finland ensures that every male Finnish citizen between the ages of 18 and 60 is obliged to answer the call in emergencies, while women are also allowed to volunteer. The system, which has been part of Finland's security strategy since World War II, has gradually come to be seen as an indispensable element of the nation's defences. Finnish soldiers undergo rigorous training, with lengths of service ranging from 165 to 347 days, depending on their role. At the end of their training, they are taken into reserve and serve until the age of 50. Officers and non-commissioned officers serve in reserve for up to 60 years. The Finnish military system's reliance on reservists means that the country can mobilise a large and highly trained force at very short notice if needed. In other words, by strengthening its defences, NATO member states are stiffening their stance against the Iron Fist. But what does the United States think about this? As we mentioned at the beginning of our coverage, the new Trump-led United States administration is in fact determined to end the war in Ukraine. Brian Lanza, who has been Trump's political advisor since his 2016 presidential campaign, has stated that the new United States administration's priority for Ukraine will be to ensure peace, rather than helping Russia regain territory it has seized in its nearly 3-year war. Following this statement, Trump's team talked about freezing the war in place, not opposing Russia's seizure of around 20% of Ukraine, and forcing Ukraine to temporarily suspend its quest to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a previously unreported idea proposed in Trump's transition office, detailed by 3 people close to the president-elect, would involve Kiev pledging not to join NATO for at least 20 years. In return, it was assumed the United States would continue to flood Ukraine with weapons to deter a future Russian attack aimed at destabilizing the peace. Under this plan, the front line would essentially be locked down and both sides would agree to an 800-mile demilitarized zone. It remains unclear who would oversee this zone, but a Trump advisor said the peacekeeping force would not include American troops or come from a United States-funded international organization such as the United Nations. Trump's advisor emphasized that the Poles, Germans, British and French should take on the task of protecting the demilitarized zone. This is where the United Kingdom and French troops in particular would come in. In some ways, this proposal echoed comments made by Vice President-elect J.D. Vance in an interview in September. Vance suggested that a final agreement to end the war could include a heavily fortified, demilitarized zone to prevent the Russians from invading Ukraine again. Vance also said that Russia would retain the territories it had captured and ensure Ukraine's neutrality. The fact that the Trump administration was moving forward with a similar plan raised the possibility that the war between Russia and Ukraine could lead to Moscow's control of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. In short, despite the difficult circumstances, the pressure to reach a settlement seems to be growing. The 3rd anniversary of the Russian invasion is just around the corner, and the situation on the front remains tense, with small Russian victories in eastern Ukraine and a war that shows no sign of ending. At the same time, Ukraine's allies, including NATO countries, have seen an increase in their defence budgets, with calls for more spending to strengthen the alliance's capacity vis-à-vis Russia. Trump has criticised European countries for not investing in defence, suggesting that NATO should be stronger and more lethal, and that European allies should bear a greater burden. In a context of growing economic and political pressure, the United States seems to be looking for a diplomatic exit, while Putin continues to pursue his militaristic approach and vision of a divided Europe. This evolving landscape reflects the complexities of international politics surrounding the war in Ukraine, with each side seeking to maximize its strategic interests. Meanwhile, human suffering remains the greatest cost of this unending conflict.
Wir müssen unsere deutsche Unterstützung für die Ukraine noch einmal ausbauen. Und zwar unverzüglich.
As we've been telling you, negotiations have broken down between U.S. President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
The history of this conflict and just how much that aid has crept up, that's European aid, and how much it's crept up since 2022.
Well, the showdown, which Donald Trump acknowledged was sure to be great television, was obviously watched closely around the world.
Beyond Ukraine, the whole of Europe has been shaken by the failure of the meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House and the heated debate.
You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
The fact that the meeting ended without reaching a conclusion raises a number of questions.
There was a woman in a blue dress who shook Zelensky's hand. I'm told that is the protocol officer, new protocol officer of the White House.
How will the European Union stand up to Moscow without the United States? How can Europe continue to support Kiev if the United States withdraws? In the midst of these questions, Germany has called for a state of emergency for the European Union and North Atlantic Treaty Organization. German Foreign Minister Baerbock demanded the immediate release of €3 billion in aid to Ukraine. This move, intended to stop Vladimir Putin, has become one of the focal points of the world agenda. We will now discuss this urgent call from Germany in detail. We will also take a closer look at how the peace process in the war between Ukraine and Russia is progressing, what steps the parties are taking, and how the European Union will fare in the wake of Germany's call. But first of all, do not forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay informed about our content. Let us get started. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has called for the release of a frozen €3 billion aid package after tensions between Kiev and Washington escalated.
Ich appelliere an alle im Bundestag vertretenen demokratischen Parteien, daher jetzt die blockierten 3 Milliarden Euro Hilfsgelder für die Ukraine freizugeben.
She also called on Germany to immediately rebuild its support for Ukraine. As a second necessary step, the German minister called for the European Union summit on March 6 to approve a comprehensive financial aid package for Kiev, including humanitarian, economic, and military assistance. At an extraordinary European Council in Brussels, Europeans are expected to announce new support measures for Kiev and consult with American allies inside and outside NATO on how to strengthen defense efforts to better share the burden. There is no doubt that Trump's accusation against the Ukrainian president will force them to rush certain decisions without waiting for their security response to be ready. Baerbock also called on Germany, France, the United Kingdom and Poland to reach a consensus on supplying long-range weapons to Ukraine. The minister believes that these steps will help Ukraine continue to resist Russian aggression, despite the announced or potential cancellation of United States aid, and will guarantee a just peace rather than surrender. He emphasized the need for swift action and the establishment as soon as possible of a new government to assume responsibility for assistance. Until then, the outgoing government must act together with all democratic forces. Baerbock also proposed the creation of a European Defence Fund, adding that investing in European security also means investing in Euro-Atlantic relations. The German minister noted that lasting peace for Ukraine is more likely with Washington than without or even against the United States. He urged the leaders to keep a cool head during the mutual work. At the same time, Baerbock warned that labelling the victim as the perpetrator and vice versa would lead to the ultimate collapse of the international rules-based order and global security. Such a development would also be detrimental to the future of the United States, as it could erode confidence in the world's oldest democracy and military power. According to Baerbock, Europeans can no longer afford to be naive that any country can sleep soundly and no longer fear Russian aggression. The minister acknowledged that the concerns are greater than ever and reiterated Germany's commitment to support a free and independent Ukraine. Germany's pledge to help Ukraine is getting a positive response from the European Union. Kaja Kallas, the European Union's top diplomat, expressed optimism that leaders will quickly agree on new money to boost short-term military aid to Ukraine as Europe grapples with Russia's exclusion from talks to end its 3-year war against its neighbour. Kaja Kallas said ministers were broadly supportive of the new military aid initiative for Ukraine. According to the package, European Union member states will commit to provide at least 1.5 million large-caliber artillery munitions, air defence systems, missiles including deep precision strikes, unmanned aerial vehicles, and support for brigade reconstruction as soon as possible in 2025. While the latest draft of the document does not include a specific amount, an earlier draft allocated €6 billion. The amount each member would have to contribute would be based on the current gross national income key. European Union countries would also be allowed to choose to contribute by supplying equipment in kind or in cash. The proposal also calls for the bloc's payments to Ukraine this year to be made by deducting the proceeds from immobilized Russian assets from the final agreed package. The next 2 tranches to be distributed are expected to reach around €880 million. Ms. Kaja Kallas said that the contents of the military assistance package for Ukraine needed to be discussed in detail and time allocated, but there was no time. Ms. Kallas said that she was therefore making a great effort to finalise the aid package as soon as possible. According to Ms. Kallas, this new aid package for Ukraine needs to be ready urgently so that the European Union can send a clear message to Russia. Kaja Kallas added that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and all member states will continue to work together to be ready to take a decision on March 6. Von der Leyen announced a €3.5 billion European Union financial aid package to provide additional liquidity to Ukraine's troubled budget and to facilitate a range of measures, including the purchase of military equipment from the country's domestic industry. The €3.5 billion was an advance on a larger €50 billion aid fund called the Ukraine Loan, which the European Union established at the beginning of 2024. The purpose of this aid fund was to deter Russian aggression in Ukraine. But in theory, there are other ways to deter Russian aggression. One of them is security guarantees, a demand that Kiev has repeatedly made. Many Ukrainian and European officials and analysts have argued that NATO should grant, or at least promise, immediate membership to Ukraine. Proponents of near-term membership believe that the threat of war with NATO implied in the alliance's security commitments would force Russia to back down. But beyond the political hurdles, opponents argue that Ukraine's NATO membership could lead directly to war, with all the risks of escalation that alliance members are trying to avoid. Analysts and officials have suggested ways to address these challenges, such as extending security guarantees only to government-controlled Ukraine. This idea has been dubbed the West German model. Some officials in the Biden administration have considered the idea of extending the membership pledge, even though such a commitment already exists. It was first made at North Atlantic Treaty Organization's Bucharest Summit in 2008 and reiterated at summits in Vilnius in 2023 and Washington in 2024. Others argue that any guarantee should wait until the end of the war, as the whole of Ukraine is now exposed to Russian missile and drone attacks. But while such discussions may recur, talk of Ukraine's possible NATO membership seems to have diminished towards the end of 2024. In fact, Trump's election may have silenced it for a while. If not NATO membership, can other useful guarantees be offered? 19 NATO member states, including the United States, Japan, and the European Union, have signed bilateral security agreements with Ukraine, all promising continued military support for 10 years. But while the agreements commit this assistance to ensure that Ukraine's military remains capable, and, in some cases, are even specific about the types of weapon systems, they are not binding treaties. Even if they were, they would provide little comfort about the volume and quality of assistance. To the extent that NATO members enter into bilateral treaties or multilateral arrangements that offer binding security guarantees, they will raise the same issues as NATO membership. If a North Atlantic Treaty Organization member state is forced to join the war on the side of Ukraine and is subsequently attacked by Russia, other members will have to help it. Otherwise, the credibility and future of the alliance is at risk. The same difficulties arise if no binding treaty is signed, but NATO allies send forces to help Ukraine. If they do so while Ukraine is at war or after an unstable peace has broken down, NATO could very well be drawn in if these forces find themselves at war with Russia. This could lead to Russia attacking NATO members and vice versa. The same problems arise if NATO member states deploy peacekeepers to the war zone once the war is over. France and Britain have publicly discussed this possibility. The logic is partly that these troops would act as a trigger, guaranteeing that if the war resumes, the countries sending forces and their allies would be immediately involved. If Russia makes grand plans against NATO in the long term, plans by the European Union and European NATO member states to not only support Ukraine over time, but also to strengthen their own weapons production, force building and deployment capacities, are more easily promised than realized. The growing requirements of such plans coincide with the apparent erosion of United States' commitment to their security and the pressure from the Trump administration to take responsibility for their own defense. Going forward, European countries will have to confront and somehow overcome the discrepancies between their declared need to deter a large-scale war with Russia and the political challenges inherent in increasing spending and cooperation, as well as sustaining them in the future. As for spending, the transatlantic bloc states have already done a lot. NATO member states have increased their defense budgets. 23 of North Atlantic Treaty Organization's 32 members are on track to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product on defence in 2024. As agreed at the Alliance's summit in Vilnius in 2023, with some far exceeding this target. Trump has called on NATO members to further increase their defence spending to 5% of gross domestic product. This is more than alliance members, including the United States, currently spend. But gross domestic product share is only a benchmark for progress and does not cover the shoreline. Neither proportional nor direct defence spending is an adequate measure of preparedness. After all, budgets can be well or badly spent depending on what is bought and how much is paid for it. This is where the difficulties begin. On the other hand, Europeans have long talked about strategic autonomy in the defence sector and the need to be able to act autonomously when and where needed. But Europe's defence industries were not designed for rapid ramp-ups or mass coordinated production. Individual states do their own procurement and purchasing. They buy about half of what they buy from the United States. But European firms are also involved in the production of United States weapons. European production, meanwhile, is dominated by a handful of multinationals. They and national firms are producing a lot of systems for European customers that are not compatible with each other in reality as well as in theory. Ukraine has experienced the effects of this as they have seen their European backers send them an eclectic arsenal, the kind you would see in a video game. Since the start of the full-scale war, the European Union and its executive body, the European Commission, have tried to make it easier to increase and sustain mass production and coordinate standards and requirements. To facilitate investments, Brussels has changed its policies on how available funds can be spent to help its members free up money. Bloc members can achieve their goals by seeking closer defence industrial ties between European Union member states and non-European Union European NATO members and other states, such as Switzerland or South Korea. To some extent, they are already doing this, but not uncontroversially. These options require overcoming both European Union procurement arguments and country-specific obstacles, such as the Republic of Cyprus's use of its European Union member status and the bloc's unanimity rules to block defence industry cooperation with Ankara. They also seek to maintain United States involvement, partly by continuing to buy arms, and partly by convincing the Trump administration of the value of remaining committed to Europe. The politics of this balancing act will not be easy for European leaders. Historically, reliance on the United States and NATO as Europe's security coordination mechanism has shielded European countries from the political challenges inherent in increasing defence spending and keeping it high over time, as well as coordinating security priorities among dozens of independent countries. But with the United States less involved, European Union and NATO members must find a way to overcome both internal opposition and their own disagreements. Even if leaders largely agree that the threat from Russia is real, European voters, whether they agree or not, may be more concerned with economic security and migration. They may put in place new governments with different priorities, willing to take their countries on new strategic trajectories. The consensus-based European Union and NATO may therefore find themselves hampered in their efforts to advance their security agendas. On the other hand, Europe is also working to ensure the continent's security. In this context, France is reportedly considering deploying Rafale fighter jets of its strategic air forces to Germany. A French official said that sending a few French nuclear jet fighters to Germany should not be difficult and would send a strong message. The same official said that if the French were to deploy a nuclear deterrent in Germany, it would increase pressure on the British to do the same. Therefore, another reason for doing so would be to pressure the United Kingdom to share its nuclear weapons with Germany. While France is in a position to deploy nuclear-capable aircraft to Germany, the United Kingdom relies solely on a submarine-based nuclear deterrent centred around Trident 2D5 missiles. France's Deterrence Force programme is thought to include 300 nuclear weapons with both sea and air launch systems. As part of the United Kingdom's existing NATO commitments, it already provides a nuclear umbrella to its European North Atlantic Treaty Organisation allies, including Germany. The French position is different. France wants a European nuclear deterrent, not a NATO-sized one. France has both submarine-launched ballistic missiles and air-launched nuclear missiles of its own design. Importantly, these weapons are technically independent of NATO nuclear planning. Unlike the United Kingdom's nuclear deterrent, this is closely intertwined with that of the United States. The independence of France's nuclear deterrent from NATO gives Paris more flexibility in negotiations on how to extend its nuclear umbrella to alliance allies in Europe. The move marks a shift in Europe's defence strategy amid lingering concerns about United States security guarantees and nuclear deterrence. 2 days before Germany's federal elections, United States Vice President J.D. Vance proposed withdrawing United States troops from Germany. This would have dealt a major blow to the continent's security structures, and it would mean a major shift in position and a major strategic shift, as Germany looks beyond the United States to the United Kingdom and France for its nuclear security measures. Under President Trump, he claims that America can no longer guarantee European security. The Christian Democrats in Merz have traditionally clashed with France over Paris's demand for greater strategic autonomy in the European Union to protect its relations with the United States. This shift shows that the European Union wants to move rapidly towards becoming a nuclear superpower. Nuclear sharing is a concept that France has constantly raised. In 2007, former French President Nicolas Sarkozy offered to start talks with Germany to find a way to share its nuclear arsenal. However, the then German Chancellor Angela Merkel rejected the idea. Macron also made a major initiative to promote the idea of a Europeanized French nuclear deterrent in 2020. Subsequent French attempts at nuclear diplomacy were also fruitless in Germany until February 2025. Merz said that we should be prepared for the possibility that Donald Trump will no longer unconditionally support North Atlantic Treaty Organization's commitment to mutual defense. In my view, the Europeans must make the greatest possible effort to ensure that we can at least defend the European continent on our own. Given France's long-standing frustration with Germany on defence, French politicians and officials welcomed Merz's comments. Germany already has nuclear weapons. Together with Turkey, Italy, the Netherlands and Belgium, Germany hosts United States nuclear weapons under NATO's nuclear sharing policy. These countries host United States B-61 nuclear gravity bombs at different bases. To participate in this program, countries must have fighter jets capable of deploying these weapons. Interestingly, all these countries except Turkey will use the F-35A Lightning II. In this configuration, deterrence depends heavily on the United States. Germany currently has 20 United States B-61 nuclear bombs at Buchel Air Base, which are provided for the German Luftwaffe's Tornado aircraft. This base is being upgraded for Germany's future nuclear-capable F-35As. These bombs can be loaded onto German fighter jets, but the United States must give permission. Germany does not want to give up United States nuclear weapons. Yet, Macron's push to Europeanize France's nuclear weapons gives Germany more bargaining power with the United States. This means that the United States will lose its leverage over Germany's security. In sum, there is no perfect solution to Europe's security dilemmas. But the most lasting way forward begins with ending a war that will ensure Ukraine remains sovereign and able to defend itself, and Russia is wary of the costs of renewed aggression. These outcomes are both more likely and more sustainable if the transatlantic European countries become increasingly self-sufficient, while the United States remains involved, albeit at a lower level. This future will be more achievable and more lasting if all parties at least begin to discuss how they can cooperate to reduce risks on an increasingly militarized continent. Thank you for tuning in. With Donald Trump's re-inauguration, French President Emmanuel Macron's peacekeeping initiative, and UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer's visit to Kiev, the question was once again on the agenda. Are Britain and France really preparing to send troops to Ukraine? Could this possible mission, described by one side as a peacekeeping force, be characterized as an unacceptable escalation in Russia's eyes? In December, the British and French governments revived discussions about deploying Western troops to protect Ukraine from further Russian aggression. Now, The prospect of the UK and France sending peacekeepers to Ukraine has become a hot topic. But what would Putin's predicament look like if the two NATO members were to do so? What kind of deterrent measures do the UK and France, as well as the US and other alliance members, have in mind to end the war in Ukraine? All these questions we will now explore together. UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron are discussing sending British and French troops to Ukraine as peacekeepers after a possible deal to end the war. The proposal comes at a time when European leaders are scrambling over how to continue supporting Ukraine's sovereignty as President-elect Donald Trump presses Kiev to strike a peace deal with Russia. The peacekeeping mission should become a guarantor of security and peace if Ukraine and the Russian Federation agree to end hostilities. Discussing this idea is becoming increasingly important against the backdrop of talks between political leaders of different countries about the ceasefire and peace talks in Ukraine. There are currently 3 possible scenarios for the deployment of peacekeeping troops. The first scenario is the deployment of British troops along the borderline between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. British troops would patrol the area using aircraft and armoured vehicles. These troops will deploy rapid reaction forces in the rear to neutralise potential threats. The second scenario involves the creation of a defensive cordon around Kiev. But this is an unlikely scenario. It is called nuclear because it would involve large-scale troops. The last scenario involves the transfer of the British training programme for Ukrainian troops to Ukrainian territory. The transfer of the mission, according to the initiator's idea, would reduce logistical costs and speed up training. France, Poland and other EU countries could also be involved. These countries could be involved in joint work to control the buffer zone, air defence, training of Ukrainian troops. But officials in London and Paris are keeping the details of the talks secret. The British government's public position is that Western allies should give Zelensky as much support as possible, while Ukrainians should decide when and whether to hold peace talks. As ministers and officials wait for Trump to push Ukraine and Russia to the negotiating table in private talks, planning is underway for what happens next. One idea that is increasingly being discussed, not only in public but also behind closed doors in Westminster, is whether Western troops should guarantee any peace terms. The idea revolves around the idea that Russia could retain the Ukrainian territory it has seized under a peace deal. But there is still a lot of uncertainty about this possibility. If that happens, European leaders are considering what can be done to protect the remaining territory of Ukraine from future Russian aggression. The difficulty is that Mr. Trump's past criticism of deploying troops abroad and his political attacks on Ukraine over financial support mean that US troops are unlikely to participate. Many British officials say they have come to this conclusion. One idea floated by the US is that Western troops could man an 800-mile border between Ukraine and Russia, creating a demilitarized buffer zone. Mr. Macron has floated the idea that European allies could be deployed on the ground to play such a role. British officials have stressed that they have not yet fully endorsed the proposal, but the fact that these talks are taking place shows how determined Downing Street is to continue supporting Ukraine even after Mr. Trump takes office. The Prime Minister visited Kiev on January 16th and discussed with Zelensky the deployment of peacekeepers to Ukraine. The two leaders also plan to sign a historic 100-year partnership to strengthen relations between the two countries on defence, health, economy, and more. Any commitment to send troops would put significant pressure on the Ministry of Defence budget at a time when the Treasury is making spending cuts. Sir Keir will announce in the spring a timetable for increasing the UK's defence spending from 2.3% to 2.5% of gross domestic product annually. However, it remains to be seen whether this level can be reached before 2030. Such a deployment could involve thousands of British troops, following warnings from military leaders that the UK does not have the capacity to wage a war. There is also a risk that the move could be seen as an escalation by Russia. Since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of the country in February 2022, successive prime ministers have refrained from announcing the deployment of British troops in Ukraine. Ukraine is not part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which has a rule that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all members. But the UK would like Ukraine to become a member one day. Questions such as whether and how to enforce a no-fly zone over the new Ukrainian territory are sure to be on the agenda. Former Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson has expressed interest in the West sending peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. Boris Johnson said that Western countries must prevent Russia from rearming and launching another attack on Ukraine in the future, and that they must make clear what security guarantees would be offered. Johnson's proposal is likely to ensure that NATO's Article 5, which states that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all members, would be triggered if Western troops serving in a UN peacekeeping force were attacked. The former Prime Minister has therefore called for Ukraine to become a NATO member as soon as possible, as this would be the only solution in the long term. According to experts, the NATO troops Boris Johnson is referring to do not necessarily enter Ukraine to aggressively confront Russian forces. These additional NATO troops could create a security bubble over a significant part of Ukraine that is not occupied by Russia. According to analysts, this would significantly strengthen Ukraine's chances of ending the war on its own terms, and such a presence is inevitably necessary for stabilization once the conflict ends. The only way to convince Russian President Vladimir Putin that Ukraine's sovereignty and independence are no longer vulnerable to his revisionist hegemonic ambitions is seen as a concrete security guarantee, evidenced by a military presence on the ground. While a NATO mission to Ukraine and NATO membership would have the maximum effect, a strong transatlantic coalition of the willing would be sufficient and could help achieve the former. Europe could provide the bulk of such a force. However, experts believe that Putin will not be persuaded unless the United States also gets involved by providing the necessary enabling capacities, such as intelligence, air cover, air defense, and long-range strikes. But what does the US think about this? As we mentioned at the beginning of our coverage, the new Trump-led US administration is in fact committed to ending the war in Ukraine. Brian Lanza, who has been Trump's political advisor since his 2016 presidential campaign, has stated that the new US administration's priority for Ukraine will be to ensure peace, rather than helping Russia regain territory it has seized in its nearly 3-year war. Following this statement, Trump's team talked about freezing the war in place, not opposing Russia's seizure of around 20% of Ukraine, and forcing Ukraine to temporarily suspend its quest to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a previously unreported idea proposed in Trump's transition office, detailed by 3 people close to the president-elect, would involve Kiev pledging not to join NATO for at least 20 years. In return, it was assumed the United States would continue to flood Ukraine with weapons to deter a future Russian attack aimed at destabilizing the peace. Under this plan, the front line would essentially be locked down and both sides would agree to an 800-mile demilitarized zone. It remains unclear who would oversee this zone, but a Trump advisor said the peacekeeping force would not include American troops or come from a US-funded international organization such as the United Nations. Trump's advisor emphasized that the Poles, Germans, British and French should take on the task of protecting the demilitarized zone. This is where the UK and French troops in particular would come in. In some ways, this proposal echoed comments made by Vice President-elect J.D. Vance in an interview in September. Vance suggested that a final agreement to end the war could include a heavily fortified, demilitarized zone to prevent the Russians from invading Ukraine again. Vance also said that Russia would retain the territories it had captured and ensure Ukraine's neutrality. The fact that the Trump administration was moving forward with a similar plan raised the possibility that the war between Russia and Ukraine could end with Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson under Moscow's rule. So what does Russia want to end the war? Sergei Shoigu, secretary of the Russian Security Council, said that the West should recognize that Russia won the war in Ukraine and negotiate to end it. Shoigu, an ally of President Vladimir Putin and defense minister since 2012 until Putin dismissed him in May, also stressed that the West tried to use Ukraine to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia but failed. According to Shoigu, Ukraine must give up its NATO ambitions and withdraw its troops from all 4 regions claimed by Moscow. Still, one of Putin's closest aides, Shoigu's statements will probably not be accepted by the Ukrainian government. In fact, this is what Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin wanted. Putin wanted a certain part of Ukraine to remain occupied by Russia and Crimea to be under his control. But these demands of the Russian leadership forced the NATO alliance to take tougher steps. For example, Poland started to build fortifications along the border it shares with Russia, following the escalation of tensions following the war in Ukraine. The fortifications are called the Eastern Shield. According to Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, initial work is taking place close to the Russian border. The Eastern Shield is a comprehensive national defence initiative launched by Poland in May 2024 to strengthen its eastern borders with Belarus and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. The programme represents one of the most significant investments in Poland's national security and border defence in its post-war history, with the government receiving around $2.5 billion in investments for its implementation. The first of the main components of the Eastern Shield are physical barriers. It involves the construction of fortifications, including anti-tank ditches, bunkers, and other obstacles to prevent and control border crossing. Anti-tank ditches and exploding camouflage will be built along the border, and new wells will be dug in the area to prevent the physical movement of a large invading force. Physical barriers will be prepared, new bunkers will be built with stored ammunition, and to ensure that Poland's own forces can move where they are needed, new road crossings will be built, and existing bridges will be assessed and, if necessary, reinforced to carry heavier loads. There are also advanced surveillance systems, deployment of modern surveillance technologies, including image intelligence, signals intelligence, and acoustic monitoring, some of which are powered by artificial intelligence, are key parts of these systems. These systems aim to improve situational awareness and early threat detection. Implementing electronic warfare capabilities and anti-drone systems against potential air threats is also a vital part of the Eastern Shield. Establishing operational centres for data analysis, integrating surveillance data with weapon systems, and improving local infrastructure to support military operations are also key components. So the Eastern Shield will be a mix of physical barriers designed to slow incoming forces and higher-level surveillance systems, including some powered by artificial intelligence. It also includes preparing forward operating bases, preparing logistics nodes, and building infrastructure suitable for anti-drone systems. National Defence Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz described the effort as the largest operation to strengthen Poland's eastern border, the eastern flank of NATO since 1945. He described it as an important part of the government's election pledge to defend Poland's borders. The project is scheduled to be completed by 2028. Poland will purchase heavy engineering equipment for the construction of barriers on the border with Belarus and Russia as part of the Eastern Shield programme. The total value of the contracts is approximately PLN 600 million, exceeding $152 million. Last month, Deputy Minister of National Defence Cezary Tomczyk stated this. The new equipment is expected to strengthen the capabilities of engineers and troops that will prepare and build engineering barriers on the Polish-Belarusian border. The first tests of the barrier and fortification elements to be used in the Eastern Shield programme took place in mid-October at the Orzysz training ground. The event in Orzysz was meaningful insofar as it realistically reproduced what Polish soldiers might face in a few years' time. The purpose of the Eastern Shield is to impede the enemy's mobility. It would increase armed forces and civilian security and facilitate the mobility of Polish troops by improving local roads and bridges. On the other hand, Germany took the last very important step against Russia's demands for an end to the war. The Berlin government has revealed that it has begun drawing up plans on how it can help deploy some 800,000 NATO troops, including Americans, to Ukraine as Russia's nuclear saber-rattling reaches new heights. The plan, dubbed Operation Deutschland, runs to 1,000 pages. According to German media sources, the top-secret documents on the plan reportedly detail specific buildings and infrastructure that need to be protected so they can be used by the military, and how businesses and civilians should prepare in case of increased threats. The documents also say that Berlin is preparing a way to push 200,000 military vehicles onto German soil in case the alliance needs to join Ukraine's efforts. In the operational plan, Germany also advises citizens on ways to prepare for the worst by increasing their self-sufficiency through mechanisms, including installing diesel generators and even wind turbines. Sweden and Norway have also recently published brochures and literature instructing their citizens on how to prepare in case the Ukrainian conflict spills over into their countries. These precautionary moves signalled NATO's acceptance of the Operation Deutschland plan, although Berlin has been criticised for its perceived hesitancy to support Ukraine's war since 2022. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock claimed in a statement that the country did not fear Putin's nuclear policy change. Following these statements, Operation Deutschland was characterized as a retaliatory step against Putin's change of nuclear doctrine. Putin stated that the nuclear mission was being expanded and outlined numerous changes from the previous 2020 doctrine. Putin then approved changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine, specifying the conditions under which the country will consider using its own arsenal. The doctrine now says that an attack by a non-nuclear state will be considered a joint attack on Russia if supported by a nuclear power. The update was proposed in September and approved on Tuesday, the 1,000th day of the war with Ukraine. Under the amendments, a major attack on Russia by conventional missiles, drones or aircraft would also meet the criteria for a nuclear response to any critical threat to Belarus or Russian sovereignty. Any attack on Russia by a coalition member state would be perceived by Moscow as an attack by the entire group. The updates increase the number of countries and coalitions that could be subject to a possible nuclear response, and the types of military threats, state news agency TASS reported. Putin has previously threatened to use nuclear weapons, which Ukraine criticised as nuclear saber-rattling to prevent its allies from providing more support. However, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Russia was in favour of making every effort to prevent a nuclear war. Speaking at a press conference on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, Lavrov made it clear that the declaration signed by the grouping, which includes Russia, is about moving towards a world free of nuclear weapons. In this regard, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that the text of the nuclear doctrine is very important and requires deep analysis. Since its illegal invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, Russia has tried to implement its playbook of nuclear threats in Ukraine. An expert study earlier this year found more than 200 cases in which Russian leaders referred to nuclear weapons in the context of the war in Ukraine. As the conflict on the ground has escalated, so have Russian nuclear threats. In the last 6 months alone, Russia has conducted military exercises with Belarus involving tactical nuclear weapons and, in an unprecedented move, publicised the exercises to the Russian public. Russia also withdrew its ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 2023, and Ryabkov revealed earlier this month that Russia is fully prepared to resume testing if necessary. With such moves, Russia was normalising a dangerous nuclear discourse. International reactions to Russia's nuclear saber-rattling have been mixed. While the leaders of China and India were thought to be pressuring Putin to refrain from escalation and potential nuclear use in October 2022, many states were conflicted about publicly condemning Russia's actions and threats. Many countries in the global south widely condemned the nuclear escalations without explicitly calling out Russia for its alliances with Moscow. Since the obvious reactions were not severe, it became possible for Russia to believe that it could continue to make nuclear threats with minimal consequences. The new doctrine held third-party states responsible for supporting conventional attacks against Russia, even if they were not the perpetrators of the attacks. The updated version of the document proposed that aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear weapon state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear weapon state, should be considered a joint attack against the Russian Federation, Putin said. In particular, this amendment seems to explicitly target NATO members that have armed Ukraine in the ongoing war, Russia's previous nuclear doctrine, on the other hand, said that nuclear weapons could be used if there was data confirming an incoming ballistic missile attack. But the new version also expands the nature of incoming attacks that could warrant nuclear use to include airstrikes, such as aircraft, missiles, and drones. This seems clearly tailored to the ongoing war in Ukraine and an attempt to increase the risks for NATO members supporting Ukraine. The most important takeaway from these changes in Russian doctrine is that they target NATO in the context of Ukraine and signal that the conditions for Russia to use nuclear weapons are expanding and that it is more willing to escalate the ongoing war. In sum, Russia's threatening pressure environment and its nuclear games trigger the idea of NATO's deployment of troops to Ukraine and pave the way for urgent action by the United Kingdom and France. At the same time, Russia's behaviour is reigniting the debate on Ukraine's NATO membership. We will see more clearly NATO's reactions, security measures, and whether it will send troops to Ukraine or not. But if Russia continues its nuclear threats and its dangerous cooperation with North Korea, NATO is likely to take much more decisive steps in the future to send troops to Ukraine. The country is a NATO member and was one of the few suppliers of military equipment to Ukraine in the early stages of the war. Moreover, Ankara has developed deep strategic defence cooperation with Kiev beyond the sale of drones. Turkey's relations with Ukraine are therefore more strategic in nature. Nevertheless, Turkey has close ties with Moscow. Moreover, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has a close personal relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Likewise, Turkey has refrained from joining the Western sanctions against Russia. These factors enable Ankara to maintain good relations with both Ukraine and Russia, enabling it to play multiple roles throughout the conflict: diplomatic, economic, security, and humanitarian. Despite the constraints, Ankara could play an important role if President-elect Donald Trump decides to pursue a diplomatic path in the war. Turkey is the strongest NATO littoral state on the Black Sea, with close ties to Ukraine and Russia. Moreover, Turkey has made similar efforts in the past to bring peace to Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, despite criticism from the West, Turkey has tried to walk a fine line to showcase its diplomatic skills. It was a strategy that yielded tangible results. First, Turkey hosted an important meeting in Antalya in March 2022, bringing together the foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine for bilateral talks. Although this meeting was a dead end with no prospects, it was the first high-level interaction between the two countries since the conflict began, highlighting Turkey's role as an early mediator. A more productive initiative was the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This initiative stemmed from concerns that started at the beginning of the Ukrainian war. When the war started, it led to a global food crisis and grain shortages. On July 22, 2022, Turkey and the United Nations brokered an agreement between the warring parties to establish a transport corridor for Ukrainian grain, a lifeline for 349 million people. This agreement was crucial to alleviate the food crisis and strengthen the Ukrainian economy at a turbulent time. Building on its role as a diplomatic facilitator, Ankara hosted US and Russian spy chiefs to discuss nuclear threats in November 2022. Likewise, Turkey's diplomatic efforts were instrumental in the recent prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine. This deal was warmly welcomed by the international community, ensured the safe return of key detainees, and demonstrated the effectiveness of Turkey's mediation role. Turkey's political position is an enabler for such a role. Since the beginning of the war, Turkey's position was ultimately unique. On the one hand, Turkey strongly supported Ukraine's self-defense and territorial integrity and provided Ukraine with drones and other weapons. At the same time, Turkey refrained from joining Western sanctions against Russia and maintained energy ties by continuing the transfer of Russian gas, which is vital for the Russian economy. This balancing act came about as Turkey viewed the global order as more multipolar and less Western-centered, which increased the importance of regional frameworks. Such a worldview required Turkey to simultaneously maintain close ties with Russia and Ukraine. Despite these advantages, several challenges could hinder Turkey's mediation ability. First, being a central actor in the Ukrainian conflict undermines Turkey's image of neutrality. In addition to being part of the Black Sea security architecture and the ultimate custodian of control of the Straits, Turkey balances Russia in other important geographies, including Syria and Libya. In other words, Turkey is ultimately a hedge player rather than a neutral third party. Second, Russia may oppose Turkey's mediation role due to its military support to Ukraine, including the provision of Bayraktar TB2 drones. Similarly, Turkey still considers Crimea, Luhansk and Donetsk as Ukrainian territory, which could attract Russian criticism. Third, as a NATO member, Turkey is ultimately aligned with the transatlantic alliance, which Russia sees as an enemy. Fourth, the West may also be wary of endorsing Turkey's key role in ending the conflict, given uncertainties about its future position within the wider West. These concerns could be mitigated by greater clarity about Turkey's place in the post-war security order. Ankara may be willing to lean more heavily on its mediation role if it sees a clear path towards the creation of a stable and inclusive regional security framework. Regardless of its mediation role, Turkey should advocate for negotiations that can give Ukraine the opportunity to build its arsenal for recovery and self-defense, and embed Ukraine in the European security architecture. Any other position is likely to encourage Russia to continue its aggression. Recognizing this, Turkey can use its position as a counterweight to Russia in the Black Sea to influence the negotiations. Turkey should also aim to be a key actor in the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine and rebuild its defense industrial base. Such an approach would serve both a more sustainable solution and Turkey's aspiration to become a key regional power. Meaningful coordination between the US and Turkey could contribute to a sustainable ceasefire in Ukraine. The Trump administration has some room to leverage Turkey's position to end the conflict in Ukraine's favor. At a basic level, President Trump could leverage his personal relationship with President Erdogan to engage in leader-level diplomacy with President Putin, potentially creating a positive framework for negotiating talks. However, the US could also cooperate with Turkey on energy projects to reduce Turkey's dependence on Russian oil and gas. This could be a key factor in ending the war. Moreover, Turkey's contribution to the negotiations will be limited without clarity on the role of the strategic framework between the West and Turkey in the Western security architecture. A more Europeanized NATO, with Turkey playing a more prominent role, could therefore help resolve this ambiguity. A diplomatic solution also requires clarity on the future of Ukraine. The security dynamics of the Black Sea and their respective roles within the broader European security framework. Achieving this will require more intensive foreign and security policy coordination between Turkey, the European Union, and the United Kingdom. Such cooperation is important not only to ensure sustainable peace in Ukraine, but also to effectively counterbalance Russian influence in Turkey and Europe's shared neighbourhoods. However, it remains to be seen whether this cooperation will materialise. Recent statements by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan have been quite harsh. After the February 24th cabinet meeting, President Tayyip Erdogan made provocative remarks that are likely to anger European Union officials, who are caught between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. According to Erdogan, liberal democracy, the most fascinating ideology of the last century, has entered a serious crisis and deadlock. Claiming that the resulting political vacuum is being filled by far-right demagogues, Erdogan argues that Europe urgently needs a new lifeline, and Turkey is that lifeline. At a time when international political and economic dynamics are fragmenting and reconfiguring, especially in the aftermath of Trump's presidency, asymmetric dynamics and uneven development factors make it necessary to evaluate current conditions beyond traditional frameworks. On the other hand, it is important to note that Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, in a joint press conference with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, stated that membership negotiations with the EU have been frozen due to the EU's discomfort with absorbing a large country into its ranks. This context needs to be examined more closely. Erdogan's statement came on the heels of the February 23rd German elections, in which the far right gained significant ground, and the nationalist AfD became the second largest party in the Bundestag. The fact that his statements contain important observations suggests that this was a calculated statement and that he was waiting for the expected German election results to materialise. We should also note Erdogan's recent high-level meetings with EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen on December 17, 2024, and German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier in Ankara on February 5, 2025. At the time, Erdogan emphasised that Steinmeier's visit to our country was meaningful and said that they discussed urgent issues comprehensively 2 weeks before Germany's critical elections. Nacho Sanchez Amor, the European Parliament's rapporteur on Turkey, said there was a widespread feeling that there was nothing left to discuss with Turkey, but this contradicted von der Leyen's pledge in Ankara of an additional $1 billion to stop migration. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte's proposal to increase European cooperation with Turkey's defence industry is similarly meaningful, emphasising that Turkey's priorities are to protect its interests and ensure that the resurgence of the far right does not threaten European Turks. Erdogan surprisingly implies that Turkey-EU relations have improved. But can the West engage with Turkey in this process to improve relations? From the Mediterranean to the Caspian, Turkey is not only projecting power, it is carrying out a strategic restructuring, disrupting Russia's operational calculations and forcing Vladimir Putin into a reactive stance. In this context, hosting Zelensky helped Turkey maximize its influence on both East and West. First, Turkey's strategic distance from European affairs helps Ankara strengthen its position in Moscow. This is because Russia sees Turkey, free from EU constraints, as a neutral player with which it can interact. Second, its military autonomy, especially in drone warfare and weapons production, coincides with President Donald Trump's push for self-sufficiency within NATO. Trump has publicly praised Turkey after its military successes in Syria. Third, despite its relations with Moscow, Turkey remains one of Ukraine's strongest supporters, steadfast in defending Kiev's territorial integrity and countering Russian expansionism. Supporting Ukraine limits Russia's expansion in the Black Sea and strengthens Turkey's strategic position. From Ankara's perspective, a resilient and sovereign Ukraine is an important check against Russian dominance in the region. By arming Ukraine with one hand and dealing with Russia with the other, Turkey has used its strategic influence to great effect. While the US and Europe debated their next move and fine-tuned aid packages, Turkey kept Russia on edge on multiple fronts. Turkey's role in countering Russia, especially in NATO's southern neighbourhood, is too big to be sidelined. Underestimating Turkey is therefore not just short-sighted, but a strategic failure. If Europe is serious about strengthening Ukraine and containing Russia, it needs to engage with Turkey as a key strategic partner. Meanwhile, Turkey is not waiting for any consensus. Ankara will continue to exploit the gaps in Russia's geostrategic posture in its own interests. According to experts, the West should recognise Ankara's strategic importance and seize the opportunity to cooperate on shared priorities before time runs out. In short, Turkey's plan to send peacekeepers to Ukraine and its many other forms of assistance to Kiev will change the agenda considerably going forward. At the same time, Erdogan's decision, aligned as it is with the United States, will have a positive impact on the peace process efforts to end the war between Ukraine and Russia. Turkey has the potential to achieve success against Russia in the Black Sea with a strategy similar to the Blue Homeland doctrine it implemented in Libya. We can understand this more clearly by looking at the incredible steps the Turkish Navy has recently taken. In the first week of 2025, the Turkish Defence Ministry announced the construction of 31 new warships to support the country's naval power projection. The projects include an aircraft carrier, an air defence destroyer, and a new class of submarines, all of which will be new additions to the Turkish Navy. Turkey's effort to modernise its navy and increase its naval power projection capabilities is part of the country's activist foreign policy and commitment to implementing an advanced defence strategy based on domestically produced weapons. Some reports indicate that Turkey has invested over US $8 billion to build new warships, setting a record in its naval construction program. The scale of these investments highlights an extremely new direction for the Turkish Navy. At the centre is the MUGEM project, Turkey's ambitious plan to develop a national aircraft carrier with a displacement of 60,000 tons, almost 3 times the size of its first LHD drone carrier, the TCG Anadolu. Aircraft carriers are often equated with great power status in the international system, and major naval powers such as the United States and China have several such units. They serve as symbolic symbols of naval diplomacy, serving political objectives, and are often deployed in remote theatres for deterrence and coercion in crises. The possible deployment of MUGEM would make Turkey one of the few countries in the world to operate a vessel of this size and power projection capability. In terms of development, MUGEM builds on the early success of Turkey's indigenously built amphibious assault ship TCG Anadolu, which is planned to host Turkish UCAVs such as Baykar TB3, Kızılelma, and the naval variant of the Hürjet. MUGEM is also expected to house advanced units of homegrown armed UAVs, including elite models being developed by Baykar Industries. Turkey's capabilities in 5-country first-generation warfare and a high level of interconnectedness between indigenous defence products remain key features of its advanced defence doctrine, and MUGEM is likely to showcase this expertise. This naval element is one of the main forces that can intimidate Russia in the Black Sea. Another naval element that will prevent Putin from confronting Erdogan in the Black Sea is the TF-2000 anti-aircraft destroyer. The TF-2000 guided missile destroyer is a project that has been under consideration since the early 2000s, and the project has regained momentum with Turkey's latest naval move. The Navy's air defence umbrella consists mainly of 40 km range SM-1 missiles mounted on G-class frigates from the 1980s. This model is key to Turkey's advanced defence doctrine and the broader defence network under the Steel Dome AI-powered layered air defence system. In addition to a range of anti-aircraft measures, the destroyer will host a 96-cell indigenous vertical launch system capable of launching a variety of advanced munitions. Given Turkey's realisation of the inability of the bulk of its naval fleet to engage advanced aircraft at great distances, the TF-2000 remains an integral part of modernising the Navy and providing coverage to the carrier strike group to be led by MUGEM. Turkey will have a very powerful missile destroyer in the Black Sea to confront Putin if Russia opposes peace and the talks between Erdogan and Zelensky. Another naval element that prevents Putin from confronting Erdogan in the Black Sea is the Milden submarine. Milden represents another milestone in Turkey's naval power projection, responding to the urgency of increasing security reach beyond coastal waters and modernising the existing submarine inventory. Turkey's submarine arsenal is largely based on German-designed models, albeit with some degree of local input. Turkey is seeking to localise domestic production and know-how in this area as part of its ongoing efforts to bring the remaining critical components of its weapons industry ashore. The project is expected to deliver the first units in 2030. Elements used in the Turkish Navy, including submarines, are supported by important missiles, armed with indigenous weapons such as the AKYA heavy torpedo, the Atmaca anti-ship missile, and soon the Gezgin cruise missile, which provide formidable strike capabilities. These weapons will enhance Turkey's anti-access area denial strategy and create a strong deterrent in the eastern Mediterranean. Turkey's submarine arsenal was largely based on German-designed models, albeit with some degree of local input. Erdogan has recently recognised the danger and has launched a nationalisation of the Turkish Navy. In effect, this is a message to Russian President Vladimir Putin that he is not alone in the Black Sea. In addition to naval moves, Erdogan has other options to send this message to Putin. One of them, as we mentioned, is the continuation of military support to Ukraine. This is because the side that keeps its inventory constantly new holds the advantage in the war. Erdogan is aware of this situation and may reassert the trump card of military aid to Ukraine against Putin. Turkey has already provided significant military aid to Ukraine since the beginning of the war. TB2 drones, Kirpi armoured vehicles, Cobra, and many other military vehicles and resources have flowed from Turkey to Ukraine. Now, Turkey and Ukraine's strategic partnership extends even further. For example, Baykar's Akıncı fighter jet and Kızılelma fighter jet use Ukrainian-made Ivchenko Progress engines. Kızılelma has even been called the Turkish bird with a Ukrainian heart. So not only is Turkey providing unilateral assistance, but Kiev is also providing military cooperation for Ankara. However, the Ukrainian-Turkish bilateral defence partnership has room for expansion. With the first flight of the Kayan fighter jet, the two countries have started to be mentioned side by side in this regard. The jet was initially conceptualized and developed to replace the Turkish Air Force's aging F-16 fleet and support Turkey's self-sufficiency. However, the US decided to sell Turkey 40 new F-16s and equipment to upgrade dozens more. While the Kayan jet prototype currently runs on General Electric's F-110 engines that power the F-16s, Turkey aims to start using indigenous engines produced by TAI Engine Industries by 2028. However, Ukrainian ambassador to Turkey Vasil Bodnar recently stated that Ukraine not only wants to buy and use the Khan jet, but that Ukrainian teams continue to work on the engine and are competing to become partners in the project. This has raised the possibility of a role for Ukraine in the project. A partnership between Ukraine and Turkey in the joint production of engines for the Khan jet would contribute to the Ukrainian economy and provide Turkey with a reliable and stable partner in strengthening its self-defense. Turkey is also planning to export some Kayan jets to other countries, which could offer an alternative to fighter jets produced and sold by Russia and China. Once the Turks have more Khan jets and more F-16s in their fleet, they could support Ukraine with second-hand F-16s or serve as a repair and upgrade centre for F-16s owned by Ukraine and other Black Sea countries. Such possibilities are seen as a complete disaster scenario for Russian President Vladimir Putin. But another catastrophic scenario for Putin is for Turkey to use its financial instruments against Russia in a much more violent way. If you remember, Turkish banks withdrew their support for the Mir scheme, a Russian card payment tool for electronic fund transfers. Moscow was using Mir to prevent Russia's exclusion from international credit cards imposed by the West over the invasion of Ukraine. At the time, the Kremlin denounced Washington, accusing it of putting unprecedented pressure on Turkish banks to withdraw from Mir. With this move, Turkey showed that it would also fight Russia in the financial sphere. Now, after the summit between Erdogan and Zelensky, it would not be surprising if Turkey makes such a move again. In short, Turkey is an important NATO member with the potential to both support Ukraine militarily and confront Russia on land, sea and air. Its presence in the Black Sea has made Turkey the actor that can impose the toughest buffer against Russia. Erdogan is making good use of these advantages. The Turkish president is also developing positive relations with US leader Donald Trump, trying to chart the best course for how peace talks should proceed. The fact that Erdogan and Trump have been on good terms lately is one of the details pointing to the fact that the US will be on the side of steering the peace process with Turkey and EU members. Erdogan has said that EU members should also be involved in the negotiations. However, it is not clear at the moment what the EU will do in this regard. The EU wing wants Ukraine to be supported militarily and wants Russia to be completely defeated. Europe has problems with the US on this issue, but these problems may be solved in the future. Turkey's strategy is clear. The Ankara government is preparing for a peace process that it can carry out together with the US while preserving Ukraine's territory.
Earlier today, the European Union imposed its 16th round of sanctions against Russia.
And I'm so glad that we were just able to adopt the 16th package of sanctions towards the aggressor.
3 years ago, a major crisis erupted that made world news. Vladimir Putin's army launched a brutal war to invade Ukraine. This war shook not only Ukraine, but also the global balance of power. Since then, from Europe to Asia, from Washington to Moscow, the global balance has been upset. The West's response has been to impose an unprecedented series of sweeping unilateral sanctions against President Putin's regime. But so far, the harsh sanctions against Russia and Putin's relatives have not been enough to stop Putin. despite the negative picture. The European Union is now aiming to close all the remaining gaps against Russia in the fields of energy, finance, and logistics. Europe has now put on the table its toughest sanctions package against the Russian invasion. The 16th wave of sanctions is now in place, perhaps the most comprehensive and severe ever. But can this move really stop Putin, or will the Kremlin find other ways? From shadow fleet ships to oil products, from banks to digital software, will this package cut the lifeblood of the Russian economy?
I think the war could end soon.
How soon?
Within weeks.
And as United States President Donald Trump seeks to bring peace to the Ukraine conflict, how will Brussels' sanctions attack affect Washington's plans? Will Russia's falling gross domestic product and rising inflation be enough to bring Putin to the peace table? We will now explore the areas in which the European Union's 16th sanctions package will put Russia on the ropes, what kind of countermove Moscow can make, and the collision point between Trump's peace initiative and European sanctions. To see how the 16 sanctions package will have a devastating impact on Putin's ambitions, we need to look briefly at the impact of existing sanctions. The sanctions so far include restrictions on Russia's financial sector, Russia's exclusion from the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, interbank transactions, and new rules on goods and services in strategic sectors of the Russian economy. Sanctions were also announced against a wide range of designated individuals, including those close to Putin. These included facilitators of military action, soldiers and officials in the occupied Ukrainian territories, and oligarchs with assets in Western countries or interests in critical sectors considered to be associated with Putin. The 2022 sanctions round built on measures first introduced in 2014. Subsequent policies were introduced to address sanctions evasion, expanding the scope of sanctions to war facilitators outside Russia and individuals committing war crimes and human rights violations in occupied Ukrainian territory. Unfortunately, there are some loopholes in the sanctions regime, and Russia has to some extent managed to avoid their full impact. For example, the Kremlin has replaced oil exports to Western Europe by pipeline, with oil tankered to other countries through a shadow fleet. However, the impact of Western sanctions on both Russia's gross domestic product and personal disposable income levels has been significant. After 3 years of war, Russia's gross domestic product is now 10 to 12% below pre-invasion trends. Personal disposable income is 20 to 25% below where it would have been without the conflict. With both inflation and domestic interest rates in Russia now above 20%, the Russian economy looks increasingly weak. All this is taking place against the backdrop of the rapid expansion of Russia's war economy at the expense of both private sector spending and other public sector activities. But this negative picture is not enough to stop Vladimir Putin. Having driven his country to the brink, the Russian leader is still fueling his imperial ambitions. In response, the European Union has hardened its stance and adopted a new package of sanctions against Russia. This sanctions package adopted by the European Union will be the 16th of its kind. So how does the new European Union sanctions package target Russia? How might this latest sanctions package affect Vladimir Putin's strategy? For answers to our questions and more, our video begins. But first, please do not forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. All this is completely free of charge. Let us get started. The European Union has approved a new package of sanctions against Russia after United States President Donald Trump stepped up negotiations on the future of Ukraine. European Union Commissioner for Economy and Trade, Valdis Dombrovskis, emphasized the importance of the decision, stating that the European Union needs to exert more control over its sanctions policy towards Russia. The package is expected to include restrictions on Russian aluminum imports, measures against the Kremlin's shadow fleet, a phased reduction of liquefied natural gas imports, and additional sanctions on the banking sector. As part of these sanctions, 74 additional Russian-owned ships were included in the restrictions. With these elements included in the new sanctions package, The total number of ships listed increases to 153. These ships are part of the shadow fleet or contribute to Russia's energy revenues. The European Union does not want Russia to continue oil shipments with its illegal shadow fleet in order to boost its war economy. That is why the measures in the 16th sanctions package include a new listing criterion targeting those who support the operation of unsafe oil tankers. Senior European Union diplomat Kaja Kallas said that it affects everything from shadow fleet ships to game controllers used to control drones. We now have the most comprehensive sanctions ever, weakening Russia's war effort. The package includes a ban on the provision of goods, technology, and services for the completion of liquefied natural gas projects in Russia, which would also apply to crude oil projects in Russia, such as the Vostok oil project. The European Union is likely to prioritize oil, the most important resource for Putin, much more in the new sanctions package. In the new package, the European side has decided to completely ban the temporary storage of Russian crude oil or petroleum products in European Union ports or subject to free zone procedures, which have been allowed so far if they meet the price ceiling and are destined for a third country. The 16th package extends the existing software ban to restrict the export, supply or provision of oil and gas exploration software to Russia. The new sanctions package also includes agreed restrictions on Russian oil and other energy resources, as well as the complete cutting off of the Kremlin's business routes. In particular, the ban on direct imports of aluminum from Russia is one of the most striking items in the package. In addition to the restriction on imports of processed aluminum from Russia, the package also includes a ban on European Union imports of primary aluminum from Russia. In order to ensure a smooth transition for businesses, the package introduces a quota mechanism and allows for the use of 275,000 tonnes over a 12-month period, equivalent to 80% of European Union imports in 2024. The new sanctions also extend dual-use export restrictions to additional items to restrict Russia's access to key technologies used in warfare. Dual-purpose chemical precursors used in the production of chloropicrine and other riot control agents that Russia uses as chemical weapons in violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention are included in the package. Computer numerical control machines used in weapons production and software related to video game controllers used by the Russian military to fly drones on the battlefield are also among the facts that the package pays attention to. Limited exemptions and exceptions for certain dual-use and advanced technology exports have been clarified and tightened to support effective enforcement by customs and licensing agencies. It also imposed additional export restrictions on industrial goods, in particular minerals of military importance, chemicals, steel, glassware, and fireworks. In addition, the latest sanctions package also focused on transportation issues. The package extends the flight ban to ensure that third country carriers operating domestic flights within Russia or supplying aviation products to Russian airlines or operating domestic flights in Russia are listed. If listed, these airlines will not be allowed to fly to the European Union. Vnukovo Airport and Zhukovsky Airport in Moscow, 4 regional airports and the port of Astrakhan and Makhachkala, the Volga port on the Caspian Sea, will be affected by the sanctions. These locations include the ports of Ust-Luga and Primorsk on the Baltic Sea and Novorossiysk on the Black Sea. These restrictions come amid Russia's ongoing aircraft shortage due to sanctions that block imports of Western-made aircraft and spare parts. Russia's United Aircraft Corporation, which produces domestic aircraft, is struggling to meet demand. As of December 2024, United Aircraft Corporation had been able to deliver only 7 of the 108 passenger planes planned since 2022. To counter the crisis, the Russian Transport Ministry is reportedly trying to reach agreements with Central Asian countries such as Kazakhstan to allow foreign airlines to operate domestic flights within Russia. However, Kazakhstan's national airline Air Astana confirmed in October 2024 that it does not plan to participate in such agreements. The International Air Transport Association has previously emphasized that rerouted flights significantly increase operational costs for airlines, forcing carriers to use longer and less efficient flight routes to avoid using Russian airspace. There are also some restrictions on road transport. The package adds an amendment preventing Russia's share in European Union road transport businesses from rising above 25%, thus closing possible loopholes to circumvent existing sanctions. The financial sector is also hit by sanctions. Russia has channeled most of its financial flows through smaller banks. That is why the 16th package approved by the European Union wing strengthens measures in the financial sector. Entities subject to a ban on providing specialized financial messaging services have been added to the new sanctions list. The list includes 13 financial institutions. Transaction bans were imposed on 3 banks for using the Bank of Russia's financial messaging system to circumvent European Union sanctions. It was also decided to extend the transaction ban to allow the European Union to list financial institutions and crypto asset providers that participated in circumventing the oil price cap. In addition to the financial sector, the European Union also took measures against disinformation. These include the suspension of broadcasting activities of 8 additional media outlets in or directed at the European Union for their role in supporting and legitimizing Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Among those sanctioned is Lee Chang-ho, the 58-year-old head of North Korea's intelligence agency, the General Bureau of North Korean Reconnaissance, known as RGB. Lee is accused of organizing cyber attacks involving the notorious Lazarus Group, a hacker collective linked to North Korean state-sponsored cyber warfare operations. Lee's actions, including the coordination of cyber warfare and battlefield strategy in Ukraine, directly contribute to undermining Ukraine's territorial integrity. He reportedly oversaw the deployment of North Korean personnel, including cyber attack units such as Lazarus and Kimsuky, and directed guerrilla-style military operations inside Ukraine. The sanctions imposed by the European Union target 48 individuals and 35 organizations in various sectors, including the military, commercial, and political spheres. The individuals identified include senior military officials, businessmen and politicians deeply intertwined with Russia's military-industrial complex. The European Union's sanctions range from business leaders to influential political and military figures, many of whom are directly linked to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and ongoing occupation of Ukrainian territory. Individuals such as Yuri Nimchenko, a Russian senator from Crimea, and Sergei Karyakin, a former chess master and Russian senator, are singled out for their role in advancing policies that threaten Ukraine's sovereignty. These figures are part of a larger network supporting Russian-backed separatist movements on Ukrainian territory. The European Union regulation also targets individuals in Russia's military-industrial complex, including Dmitry Lelikov, Deputy Director General of Rostec, a company that produces advanced Russian military hardware. Rostec has played a key role in supplying military equipment for Russia's ongoing conflict with Ukraine. The Council of Europe's sanctions aim to cut off their financial and logistical support for Russia's war effort. European Union sanctions remain at the centre of the European Union's response to Russia's unjustified military aggression against Ukraine. This is because they reduce Russia's military and technological capacity, deprive the Kremlin of the revenues it uses to finance the war, and impose increasingly high costs on the Russian economy. In this context, sanctions contribute to fulfilling the European Union's core objective of continuing to work for a just and lasting peace. Moreover, the European Union is cooperating with India to make the sanctions more effective. Ursula von der Leyen plans to discuss sanctions against Russia with the Indian Prime Minister. The European Union will seek India's help in implementing sanctions against Russia. This is because India only complies with United Nations sanctions. It is known that India does not condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but favours dialogue and diplomacy to end the war. Russia is one of India's biggest sources of crude oil and weapons. The European Union's goal is therefore a collective effort to inflict maximum damage on Russia. What should happen to the frozen assets in this context? Will they be confiscated? Can they be used for compensation or for the reconstruction of Ukraine? Starting with individuals and firms as of January 2025, 1,733 individuals and 382 entities are subject to United Kingdom sanctions under the Russia regime, and around 2,400 individuals and entities are subject to European Union sanctions. The wide-ranging group of individuals and companies affected by the measures has resulted in the freezing of billions of pounds and dollars, including significant assets in companies and real estate. For both individuals and companies, there appears to be no incentive for them to realise their assets or to work towards the effective use of the assets. At present, those targeted have no indication that they will be able to access their assets again. They have also not been given the opportunity to have the assets unfrozen unless they take legal action. Most legal attempts to challenge the sanctions regimes have failed. At the time of writing, the first case has reached the United Kingdom Supreme Court. A lawsuit was filed by Eugene Schvidler, an associate of Roman Abramovich. Currently, sanctions policy does not offer a clear incentive for individuals to change their behaviour. For example, Abramovich offered to donate the proceeds from the sale of Chelsea Football Club in 2022 to war victims in both Russia and Ukraine. But the United Kingdom government has refused to allow the funds to be used for such broad purposes. Turning to frozen Russian state assets, in this case there are incentives to change direction. The Kremlin can free itself from punitive measures by stopping aggression against Kiev, withdrawing from occupied territories, agreeing to the establishment of a global peacekeeping force in Ukraine, and paying compensation to the Ukrainian state and individuals who suffered from the war. This is an extremely difficult order, and Russia is unlikely to accept it in the near future. The legal basis for frozen state assets is also highly complex. This is because they are not implemented through the United Nations, but as unilateral actions by individual states and the European Union. As it stands, Russia can invoke international law to challenge the measures, citing the principle of non-interference, the principle of sovereign equality of states, or state immunity. Russia can also invoke trade rules by invoking obligations under World Trade Organization rules, obligations under bilateral investment treaties, or customary international law rules on the treatment of foreign investors. However, each of these legislations has exceptions for measures taken on security grounds. In response to Russian claims that the sanctions are illegal, sanctioning states may also argue that they constitute countermeasures under the law of state responsibility. Such measures can be justified when taken against a state that has acted unlawfully. In the Russian context, this idea is controversial. This is because it undermines the inviolability of foreign sovereignty of central bank assets, especially foreign currency reserves, which is a key area of global consensus in international economic law. Ingrid Worth-Brunk, a leading international jurist, has argued that taking dramatic steps to undermine the consensus in international law may not benefit the states imposing these measures, as it could jeopardize Western leadership in the war in Ukraine and undermine confidence in placing assets in a Western central bank in the future. As a compromise, in 2024, the European Union agreed on an extraordinary approach for the mobilization of frozen Russian central bank assets in Belgium worth €210 billion. It created the Ukraine Credit Cooperation Mechanism as part of the Group of Seven commitment to provide Ukraine with up to $50 billion in financial support. Proceeds from frozen Russian assets will be used for Ukraine to service and repay loans from European Union and Group of Seven funds. The aim is to force Russia to foot the bill for Ukraine's ongoing war effort. In short, it is important to commemorate the third anniversary of the escalation of Russian aggression against Ukraine. But given President Trump's current attempts to end the war, it is not enough to predict that further sanctions will be necessary or sufficient to bring Russia to the negotiating table with Ukraine. The slow puncture of the Russian economy looks horribly stagnant and comes at a huge cost in terms of human lives, economic hardship, and global stability. Stay tuned for further developments. Thank you for watching. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications.
As Europeans, we must increase our military efforts. We, the French, have a strong army, the most effective in Europe. we will need to strengthen our defense and our security.
What will we do in Europe tomorrow if our American ally withdraws its warships from the Mediterranean Sea? These are scenarios we must prepare for.
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through...
Russia's aggression against Ukraine strikes fear into the heart of Europe. Anxiety, worry, and even panic are growing, with the question, will the continent be left defenceless if the United States withdraws its aid? However, French President Emmanuel Macron calls it a giant European plan. Some are hopeful, others sceptical. The same questions are on everyone's mind. Can Europe stop Putin without United States support? Could there even be a united European army? Ukrainian resistance, Trump's peace claims, alarm bells in the Baltics and Poland. All point to a turning point that could rewrite the fate of the continent. Let's explore together what this new European plan could bring. With evolving geopolitical dynamics and Russian aggression, the security landscape in Europe is rapidly changing. Given the ongoing war in Ukraine and the possible refocusing of United States foreign policy under Donald Trump, a full-scale conflict on the continent seems more tangible. United States President Donald Trump claims that he can end the war between Ukraine and Russia in a matter of weeks to avoid a wider crisis.
It could lead to World War III if it's not solved. You know, there'll be a point at which it's not going to stop at those two countries. I think the war could end soon.
Well, how soon?
Within weeks.
Weeks?
Yeah, I think so. Right? Don't you think so? I'd like to have you. I think we could end it within weeks.
But Russia's ambitions go far beyond Ukraine. Vladimir Putin wants to change the European security architecture. Moscow's aim is to strengthen its influence in the former Soviet sphere and weaken North Atlantic Treaty Organization's influence. If victorious in Ukraine, Russia may be inclined to question NATO's commitment to collective defense in the Baltic states and Poland. Aware of all these risk factors, countries are on high alert. France, in particular, says that Russian tyranny would pose a risk factor for the Western European flank. The Paris government is already preparing for these possible scenarios. Emmanuel Macron stated that Europe is acting in unity against Putin's threatening move and called for urgent measures to be taken.
Mais j'essaie de gérer cette incertitude pour nous. Et donc en gardant l'unité de tous, des Européens et des alliés, mais en allant aussi essayer de le convaincre qu'en fait...
So what do we know about Macron's grand plan? How can the French leader stop Russia's threats against Europe? Can other states support France in stopping Russia? We will now explore the answers to all these critical questions. But first, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay informed about our content. French President Emmanuel Macron has long sought to be at the forefront of a major shift in Europe's security landscape. The recent Paris summit was the clearest example of this. Amid concerns about United States President Donald Trump's direct engagement with Russia and his administration's intention to exclude the European Union from Ukraine peace talks, European leaders discussed the fallout from the Ukraine war. How to maintain support for Kiev in the face of shifting priorities for European security and United States priorities was a key topic of discussion. With the United States cutting its military support to Ukraine, Europe signalled that it would shoulder the entire burden. European Union leaders talked about a €6 billion aid package for Ukraine, expected to include everything from 1.5 million artillery shells to air defence systems. It would be one of the largest European Union military aid packages since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. European Union members suggest that €6 billion is a starting point and could rise to €10 billion or more as countries examine their inventories to see what they can send to Ukraine. There is now even talk of raising the aid to more than €20 billion. The French side has spearheaded this security effort against Russia, starting with this huge military aid package and addressing the European Union. French President Emmanuel Macron spoke to the European Union members about the main things they should do about the Russian invasion. Emmanuel Macron called on Europeans to increase their defence investments to ensure their own security. Macron stressed the need to spend more and better on European defence and to take quick decisions at both national and European level to increase autonomy and common power. The French leader acknowledged that European partners have reinvested in defence in recent years, but noted that many still rely heavily on the United States. Macron also pointed out that the United States is no longer Europe's priority. Asked whether France plans to intervene militarily in Ukraine, Emmanuel Macron said that his country does not intend to send troops to fight, but remains committed to negotiations for a lasting peace. However, Macron noted that France and its allies could play a role in guaranteeing Ukraine's security if a peace agreement is reached. The French leader also emphasised that Europe wants a lasting peace in accordance with international law. The United Kingdom is the biggest supporter of Macron's ideas. The proposal, backed by the United Kingdom and France, envisages a 30,000 European troop presence in Ukraine, supported by Western air and naval power, where key infrastructure such as nuclear power plants are located. Under the plan, the front line would be largely monitored remotely, using drones and other technologies. Air forces stationed outside Ukraine will be kept in reserve to deter violations and reopen Ukrainian airspace to commercial flights. Could these efforts lead to the creation of a European army against Russia? It revives the question. Countries are not ruling out the creation of a common European army and the infrastructure for its emergency response force and logistics. In fact, France, Germany, Poland and the Baltic states are seriously working on emergency deployments to the Russian borders and increasing their military forces. In order to understand the preparations for a European army and the readiness and contingency plan against Russian aggression, we need to take a closer look at the preparations of actors such as France, Germany, the United Kingdom and Poland. France's readiness for a possible Russian invasion can be better understood by looking at its arms industry, military production, and military cooperation with other countries. According to the French Ministry of the Armed Forces, in a context of technological breakthroughs, rearmament, and open discussion of the principles of international law, the 2024 to 2030 LPM aims to create a revitalised armed forces model with a budget of €413.3 billion. The amount allocated is 40% more than the previous 2019 to 2025 period of €295 billion. Within this budget and plan, all military elements of the French army will be renewed and expanded. France's armed forces continue to modernise in different operational areas. The largest amount of spending over the next few years is directed to the market segments of fixed-wing aircraft, missiles and missile defence systems, naval vessels, submarines and armoured vehicles. These investments are indicative of a renewed strategic focus on the commensurate rise of both great power competition and the risk of high-intensity conflict. The procurement of traditional capabilities such as aircraft, naval assets, artillery, armoured vehicles and weapon systems is being supplemented by investments in cybersecurity and space systems to account for the increasingly dispersed and multi-domain nature of modern warfare. At the same time, Germany is reviewing its military preparedness to counter an increasingly hostile Russia. After decades of prioritising economic recovery and political unity at the expense of military investment, the German government has announced plans to rejuvenate its armed forces. Germany is developing plans to ensure that in the event of a war with Russia, more than 800,000 soldiers and hundreds of thousands of vehicles can move along the main highway that runs through most of the country. This massive army would use Germany's ports, highways and railways to head east. The plan calls for the Western Intervention Force to be deployed within 3 to 6 months, with a large number of weapons, other equipment and around 200,000 vehicles, many of which would arrive from Germany's North Sea ports before heading to potential battlefields in the east. The A2 motorway, which stretches some 300 miles from Oberhausen in the west to the outskirts of Berlin in the east of the country, near the Polish border, will be a vital part of this mass mobilization. There are many bridges along this route, and the plan indicates that they will be the main targets of Russian missile attacks in the event of war. Such possible counterattacks could significantly delay North Atlantic Treaty Organization's mobilization efforts. That is why the Germans are already carrying out significant work on contingencies, including alternative routes and temporary bridges. Additional plans are also being made to accommodate, resupply, and feed the hundreds of thousands of Allied troops passing through Germany. According to additional plans under consideration, North Atlantic Treaty Organization convoys will have the option to stop and rest for supplies every 300 to 500 meters. It is speculated that such a massive logistical effort could require new powers for the German Federal Police, with conscription being considered and officers potentially involved in the management of any POW camps. Meanwhile, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius last month proposed a new voluntary conscription service to ensure the country is ready by 2029. What Germany is doing reflects a broader European realization that the security environment is changing and that NATO must evolve to adapt. In strengthening collective defence, the alliance has announced its most ambitious defence plans since the Cold War. Today, more than 500,000 troops are kept at a high level of readiness, and the priority for NATO is the defence of all allies. NATO has no mandate for military service, but a third of its members still rely on some form of military service, and others are considering bringing it back amid the growing Russian threat. Years of spending cuts have long eroded the ability of British forces to wage war against a peer enemy. Troop numbers have fallen from 100,000 full-time trained personnel in 2000 to around 70,000 today. Britain also lacks the capacity to produce at the levels required for modern warfare. Much will be needed for immediate capital investment, such as production capacity for weapons and ammunition. Weapons production will require longer-term investment, and supporting infrastructure, such as airfields and storage facilities, abandoned after the end of the Cold War, will need to be rebuilt, both in Britain and across Europe. There is no solution to the immediate problem other than to increase money for defence. But the United Kingdom and many other NATO members have been reluctant to increase defence spending, even though existing capacities are too diminished for European countries to field a capable force. United States President Donald Trump has called for NATO countries to increase defence spending from the current NATO target of 2% to 5% of GDP. This would be very difficult to achieve in the United Kingdom's current fiscal situation without spending cuts elsewhere. While defence ministers are reportedly pushing for an increase of up to 2.65% of GDP, Starmer said he would resist pressure to increase spending above 2.5%. The last time the United Kingdom spent more than 5% of its GDP on defence was at the height of the Cold War. The current international situation began to shift towards two separate blocks, similar to the East-West divide between 1945 and 1991. But the bipolar balance of the Cold War was replaced by increasing instability, as Russia's aggression in Georgia and Ukraine demonstrated. Replacing lost capacity is almost always more expensive than maintaining it. If the governments of past decades had maintained the capabilities of the armed forces, the overall cost would likely have been lower than the amount the country would need to invest now to achieve the same level of defence. Every defence review since 1957 has led to cuts in the defence budget in real terms. The cuts in the military budget continue because nothing before posed a sufficient sub-nuclear threat to the nation that was deemed important enough to reverse them. These cuts are now so deep that the nation is unable to defend itself. The Prime Minister said that we have to show that we are really serious about our own defence and carrying our own burden. This claim is quickly being refuted by signs that he will not increase spending in the near future. Matthew Saville, Director of Military Science at the Royal United Services Institute, said Europe would struggle to put together a force of even tens of thousands of men. The idea of a European army has hit some roadblocks, but the European Union is trying to clamp down on Vladimir Putin by strengthening its defences. Poland, on the other hand, has begun building fortifications along the border it shares with Russia, following increased tensions following the war in Ukraine. The fortifications are called the Eastern Shield The Eastern Shield is a comprehensive national defence initiative launched by Poland in May 2024 to strengthen its eastern borders with Belarus and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. It includes physical barriers, bunkers with ammunition storage, and advanced surveillance systems. The goal of the Eastern Shield is to prevent enemy mobility. It will increase armed forces and civilian security and facilitate the mobility of Polish troops by improving local roads and bridges. It will also connect to the Baltic defence line currently under construction in Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. The Eastern Shield project is consistent with defence measures developed by other member states on the eastern flank of the alliance. One such initiative is the Baltic Defence Line, a joint project of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia announced in January 2024. The construction of the fortifications aims to strengthen the Baltic states' external borders with Russia and Belarus, and thus play both defensive and deterrent roles, similar to Poland's Eastern Shield. A characteristic feature of the Baltic Defence Line is the autonomy of each country to determine the main components of the fortifications on its territory. For example, Estonia intends to focus on building bunkers, while Lithuania pays more attention to obstacles that reduce the mobility of enemy troops by making all main roads virtually impassable. Latvia, a small country of around 2 million people sandwiched between Russia and the Baltic Sea, was one of the last countries to reintroduce conscription. The country had abolished conscription in 2006, but the deteriorating security situation led to a dramatic turnaround. From January 1, 2024, Latvian men will have to register for military service from the moment they turn 18. The decision was initially met with some resistance, but the cold, hard reality of the threat to Russia's neighbours quickly changed public opinion. Norway, which already had a mandatory conscription policy, has continued to improve its defences in a changing security landscape. In April, the Norwegian government presented a long-term plan to more than double the country's defence budget and add 20,000 additional soldiers, reservists and employees to the armed forces. Lithuania, another Baltic state that has long feared Russian aggression, reintroduced military service in 2015. Outside the Baltic states, other Nordic countries such as Finland, Sweden and Norway have small standing armies but have the infrastructure to mobilise large numbers of trained reservists at very short notice. This model is particularly relevant for Finland. Although the Finnish Defence Forces has only about 13,000 active members, it can mobilise about 1 million reservists, of which 280,000 can be mobilised immediately. This system reflects Finland's historical readiness to defend itself against Russian aggression, as seen in the Winter War against the Soviet Union in 1939 to 1940. In this war, Finnish forces famously fought to a standstill. The Finnish model of military service is advertised as a model for effectively combining a small professional army with a large pool of trained civilian reinforcements. This model has worked well against the Russians in the past and remains a vital part of Finland's defence strategy. The large reserve force allows for impressively short mobilisation in the event of conflict and ensures that the country's defences are robust and resilient. It seems that Europe is stepping up its measures against a possible Russian threat. On the other hand, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that Russia will closely monitor Europe's military build-up plans. Speaking at a press conference in Moscow, Peskov said that the details of the media reports on the establishment of the European Union Army have not yet been finalised. So far, the European Union does not have a common defence structure, but as for long-term plans, they need to be carefully monitored, studied and evaluated, he said. This shows that the Kremlin is also in a state of alarm and panic. But Europeans say they will need United States help with air and missile defences to build a strong European peacekeeping force. Other important capabilities the United States can provide include logistics, intelligence and air power. Without Donald Trump's support, Europe's burden could become even heavier. But will the United States abandon its allies? The question of whether the United States will withdraw its troops from Europe has recently become a pressing concern for policymakers and military strategists. If this were to happen, not only Europe's security but also the geopolitical landscape would suffer major repercussions. Military expert Carlo Marsala tackles these complex issues in an interview. The flexible debate seems to be influencing critical assessments of the recent event in Riyadh between the United States and Russia on a peace plan for Ukraine. Neither Ukraine nor European countries took part in the meeting. According to Marsala, Trump's return to office could witness the allocation of resources to the worrying scenario of the former president extracting concessions from Putin. There are even fears that such an approval could lead Trump to withdraw United States troops from some critical NATO countries, such as the Baltic states and Poland, which would seriously weaken Europe's defence posture. This raises the question of whether Europe can defend itself without American commitment. The idea that European nation-states could potentially fill the gap left by American troops is being explored, but Marsala is not convinced. He explains that while Europe has the manpower and military capacity, the situation is complicated by NATO's collective defence obligations, forcing European countries to commit resources to a costly effort to counter Russian aggression in Ukraine, thereby further jeopardising defence against NATO's eastern flank. The loss of American troops in Europe would be enormous. In short, Europe will not be protected from aggressive Russians. Marsala insists that Europe must take proactive steps to advance its own defence capabilities, replacing United States military assets in Europe so that Europeans can defend themselves against any future threats that may be directed against them. Otherwise, Europe will make itself vulnerable to Russian imperialism. While NATO's security architecture is based on nuclear deterrence, Marsala adds that within Europe there is no guarantee of future American compliance with its nuclear commitments. While it may currently appear that aspects of United States rhetoric are keeping such guarantees intact, things are changing rapidly in the international political context, and nothing is impossible as future administrations reassess America's role as nuclear guarantor of European security. In the absence of United States support, Europe will need to create a new security framework that does not rely on American military power. This would involve creating a coalition of European states with a clear plan to increase defence spending, acquire advanced weapons, and address personnel shortages in European armed forces. The next step would be to present this plan to the United States and hope that they would accept the transition from American protection to European self-defence. If the United States refuses to support this plan, Europe faces a dangerous future and will find it difficult to protect itself from Russian aggression. Without a credible deterrent, Russia can pursue its expansionist ambitions, destabilise Europe, and threaten global peace. Europe must act quickly to strengthen its defences and ensure that it is not vulnerable to further conflict. The fate of Ukraine, the future of NATO, and the security of the European continent depend on Europe's ability to take responsibility for its own defence and prepare for a future without the guarantee of American protection. Thank you for watching us.
Germany has voted, and it is the end of the road for Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He'll most likely be replaced by this man, Friedrich Merz.
The Conservatives are celebrating in Germany tonight after exit polls put them on course for victory. Friedrich Merz is the man expected to be the next Chancellor.
Germany has just held an election, but this is no ordinary election. The shadow of the Ukraine-Russia war, Donald Trump's pressure on Europe, and economic tensions with China, all pushing Berlin to the centre of the global chessboard. Now Germany must reshape its European defence, its arms aid to Ukraine, its stance towards Russia, and its trade with China. All this, not to mention domestic economic difficulties, coalition tensions, and pressure from rising far-right parties. In this context, it remains to be seen how Germany will fare as both Europe's leading country and a global actor. So what does Friedrich Merz, the winner of the election, stand for in this ring of fire? Will he open the door to victory for Ukraine, or will he seek a compromise with Putin? And how will this election affect Europe's security architecture? Friedrich Merz, the leader of the Christian Democrats who came first in the German elections, shed some light on these questions. Mr. Merz's statements were mostly about the Ukraine-Russia war.
Gucken Sie sich die Bilder an, Frau Weidel.
Und schauen Sie sich die Menschen in der Ukraine an. Sie haben hier gerade einen sehr verräterischen Satz gesagt. Wir würden von Russland nicht mehr als neutral wahrgenommen. Nein, Frau Weidel, wir sind nicht neutral.
Mr. Merz's statements give the strongest signals of victory for Ukraine and emphasize that Vladimir Putin's ambitions are over. So how can the new German leader influence the war in Ukraine? What do the German election results mean for the US and the EU? For answers to these questions and more, our video begins. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. The Ukraine-Russia war was one of the most critical chapters in Germany's foreign policy. Germany is one of the most important supporters of Ukraine in Europe and has provided over 11 billion euros in military aid since Russia's full-scale invasion began nearly 3 years ago. This is more than any other European country. Germany is second only to the United States in its support for Ukraine. However, this attitude has led to divergent views within Germany. In particular, the rise in energy prices and the deepening economic difficulties have led to debates about how the aid to Ukraine should continue. Now it is time to put an end to these debates. Mr. Merz said that, "We are not neutral, we are not standing in the middle, we are on the side of Ukraine." Following these words, Mr. Merz said that military support for Ukraine would continue and that he would support Ukraine's full territorial integrity against Russia. In particular, it is known that long-range Taurus missiles will be delivered to Ukraine. Merz criticised Scholz's hesitation, calling it a one-handed fight for Ukraine. It is already known that Ukraine has long wanted these missiles. The Taurus Key PD-350 is a German-Swedish cruise missile fired from fighter jets with a maximum range of 500 kilometers. It can travel at a maximum speed of around 170 kilometers per hour and at a height of only 35 meters. This makes it very difficult for radar systems to detect. The Taurus missile will penetrate behind enemy lines more than any long-range Western missile in Ukraine's arsenal, increasing Ukraine's ability to deter Russian aggression and respond effectively to multiple threats. This will give Ukraine a significant advantage in precision targeting and operational flexibility. At first glance, Taurus and Storm Shadow look very similar. They have approximately the same weight and length and approximately the same size warhead. What sets Taurus apart is, first, its much greater firing range of 500 kilometers. Second, it has a Mephisto smart warhead system that combines the ability to defeat hard and deeply buried targets with the ability to explode and fragment to destroy high-value point and area targets. Germany has reportedly ordered 600 Taurus missiles. These missiles are enough to have a significant impact against Russian aggression and prevent attacks on Ukrainian cities. If the Taurus threat prompts Russia to move all of its military assets deeper, beyond the strike range of Germany's missiles, it will still severely impact Russia's combat effectiveness in its attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure. The Taurus missile would force the Kremlin to take greater risks in airstrikes, and aviation is a priceless asset that it cannot afford to lose. So German leader Merz could provide Ukraine with the key to victory. How will Merz deal with Russian leader Vladimir Putin? He will certainly have a tougher approach than Scholz. Scholz always kept in mind that he wanted to be a careful supporter of Ukraine, but he did not want to provoke Putin. Scholz did not want to cross red lines. There was probably a lot more Scholz could have done. We can expect Merz to do more of these few percentages against Ukraine. The typical conservative West German approach to Russia is tough, and this is where Merz comes from. So who is Friedrich Merz, the man who shook the geopolitical balance? Friedrich Merz is a former lawyer who admires the United States. However, as an ardent defender of Europe and NATO, Merz may find himself at odds with President Donald Trump. Meanwhile, Merz is facing increasing pressure on his right. The Alternative for Germany, AfD, a far-right party with anti-immigration and pro-Russian views, has come in second place among voters' growing concerns about immigration and the economy. It was the best performance ever for the party, but it will probably not take part in a government coalition. Other leading parties have refused to partner with the AfD because they consider it too extreme. This means that Merz will have to weave a potentially fragile government coalition partly together with the current ruling centre-left Social Democrats, who took third place. So how can Merz keep the AfD at bay? According to Gordon Rapinski, Germany's editor-in-chief and one of the most knowledgeable observers of the country's politics, Merz has to keep the AfD in check. Important figures in the United States may not support him. Tech giant Elon Musk, a close associate of Trump, has been an outspoken supporter of the AfD, and Vice President J.D. Vance recently met with its leader. Trump, for his part, seemed to take solace in the fact that Merz's winning alliance was conservative, writing on social media, "See, this is a great day for Germany." But Merz announced a potentially decisive decision on Trump and put Europe's 80-year alliance with the US in the past. Merz said that the Trump administration does not care about Europe and is allying with Russia. The new leader warned that the continent urgently needs to strengthen its defences and potentially even find a replacement for NATO. Merz's remarks mark a historic turning point. They reveal how deeply Trump has shaken the political foundations of Europe, which has been dependent on American security guarantees since 1945. If Merz continues his rhetoric after the formation of a new government in the coming weeks, he will steer Europe in a radical new direction at a critical time for the security of Ukraine and the wider region. On the other hand, Merz will take Germany in a different direction from that of the current Chancellor Olaf Scholz. By 2021, it may not even resemble the Germany that Angela Merkel, also of the CDU, has led for 16 years. Last month, Merz, with the support of the far-right Alternative for Germany party, pressed the German parliament for new immigration measures. This was a clear departure from Merkel's Wir schaffen das pledge to accept refugees. Friedrich Merz is the opposite of Angela Merkel in terms of rhetoric and approach to politics. They have a very special relationship. Friedrich was on the rise in the Conservative Party in the 90s and, in parallel with Angela Merkel's rise, he was in a powerful position as the chairman of the CDU-CSU parliamentary group in the early 2000s. At one point, Angela Merkel fired Friedrich Merz from his position as group leader. Merz, in a very angry state, quit politics and followed Angela Merkel's chancellorship from the sidelines. He was very critical of her actions. When he ran for the party leadership after Angela Merkel resigned, he advocated the opposite approach to politics to Angela Merkel. This means a more traditional conservative approach, whereas Merkel was really integrated in the middle, very understanding of her political opponents. Merkel was a politician who was not arrogant, who did not look for unnecessary fights, whereas Friedrich Merz is one of those people who likes to fight, who likes to make sharp speeches, but who also says things that may not be useful for him in the long run. Olaf Scholz, like Angela Merkel, is not a very charismatic person. He is someone who always tries to integrate into the other political party. In that respect, they were quite similar. The difference was that Angela Merkel was humble in her approach and in her non-charismatic appearance, and Olaf Scholz was rather arrogant in his non-charismatic appearance. In short, after 2 decades of very timid and very defensive communication, which we saw with Angela Merkel and Olaf Scholz, we are going to witness a big change in terms of political communication. In conclusion, why did Merz's party outperform Scholz's party? What were the main ideological and personal factors behind this? The Conservative Party is structurally a little bit stronger than the Social Democratic Party in Germany. If you look at history, most of the years have been with Conservative chancellors, and at very specific times, or with very specific candidates, you had a Social Democratic majority. So there is a structural advantage for the Conservative Party among the population. But Olaf Scholz also had a very difficult time in government. He was working in a complex coalition with 2 partners, so 3 partners in total, and very different policy approaches. The energy crisis hit Germany very hard, because gas prices were going up so much, and Germany was obviously very dependent on Russian gas. Germany saw a lot of inflation and economic turmoil. This obviously resulted in the population losing confidence in the government and also in the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. We think there is a shift in the political debate in Germany towards harder immigration. All these things that you see in the US, we are seeing in Germany. In this context, Friedrich Merz is a candidate who can also satisfy these aspirations or tendencies of the population. Germany has seen many attacks by migrants in the last 12 months, and the population really wants change. What does a Merz-led Germany mean for the EU? 2 days before the election, Merz issued a stern warning that Europe must be ready to defend itself without the US. Merz has promised big, sweeping policies to grow Germany's defence industry and is expected to quickly fulfil his predecessor's promise to lift the ban on sending long-range Taurus cruise missiles to Ukraine for attacks on Russian targets. A key theme of his first weeks as Chancellor will be to explain how Berlin will raise the money to expand the $100 billion fund agreed by the Scholz government for the renewal of Bundeswehr equipment and facilities. This cash has been earmarked and will be spent on large-scale procurement programs until 2027, raising questions about how Berlin plans to meet its obligations to NATO from the traditional national budget. German energy policy in recent years has focused on accelerating investment in renewable energy, shutting down nuclear reactors, and outsourcing gas imported from Russia. Merz's CDU has similarly vowed to use renewable energy in perpetuity. But his political family, the centre-right European People's Party, also opposes the EU's green energy goals. Merz, meanwhile, has taken a warmer stance on nuclear power than Scholz, who is challenging a long-standing German taboo around atomic energy. While the country is unlikely to revive its closed reactors, a more tolerant nuclear stance from Berlin could help pro-nuclear countries persuade Brussels to treat atomic energy like renewables. Merz also said he wants to repeal Germany's hard-fought Building Energy Act, which aims to speed up the rollout of clean heating practices, a message to green skeptics across Europe. A Merz-led government would place less emphasis on climate change than Scholz's coalition. In his election campaign, Merz raised concerns about the impact of climate policy on business, vowed to put economic growth above all other concerns and called for the rollback of several EU green regulations. But in government, green advocates say they are counting on Merz's rhetorical hammer turning into a feather duster. Industry, in general, wants less bureaucracy, but it also wants coherent policy. Industrial incentives can be used to help companies become greener and more efficient. Merz, like Scholz, wants to delay key corporate sustainability reporting rules to revive Germany's ailing sector. This means that Germany under Merz is almost certain to support a strong simplification bill for green rules. The European Commission is expected to publish this proposal on February 26th. Merz's victory also means that the centre-right European People's Party, the political family of Merz that dominates the European Parliament, once again has a strong ally in the EU's largest economy. The EPP has worked hard to water down the EU anti-deforestation rule with the support of groups further to the right. Merz inherits an economy in recession, dragged down further by a crisis engulfing the automotive sector. He is aware of the problems: high energy and labour costs and stiff competition in the electric vehicle transition. But he has been short on details on how he plans to help automakers. In his election speeches, he promised to cut red tape and reduce high costs, but he stopped short of backing reform of Germany's debt brake. This would tie Merz's hands when it comes to financing such initiatives. Germany's car makers are highly dependent on the Chinese market. This has led Scholz to bend to Beijing's wishes, for example, by lobbying against Chinese EV taxes. Merz will take a tougher line against China and has made it clear to car makers that they should not come crawling to him if Asian investments boom. Merz, who wants to take a stronger stance against Russia and China and rekindle old friendships with EU leaders, has a lot of work ahead of him if he wants to connect the German export economy to global growth centres like the Mercosur countries, Mexico, or Southeast Asia. Merz recognises that a functional Franco-German axis could create more trade agreements, more certainty for companies, and a stronger Europe. The Christian Democrat has also signalled a tougher approach towards China, or at least he acknowledged that the German economy is too dependent on Beijing's inconveniences and demands. How hawkish Merz's approach to trade will be, however, will depend on who he ends up with as a coalition partner. The victory of Merz's Christian Democratic Union, CDU, means that Berlin will be allied on agricultural policy both with the largest political bloc in the European Parliament, the European People's Party, led by Bavarian State Councillor Manfred Weber, and with EU Agriculture Commissioner Christopher Hansen. Ahead of negotiations on the future of the EU's common agricultural policy, Hansen has launched a farm policy overhaul that would effectively roll back the green agenda of recent times and instead emphasise making farming a more attractive and economically viable profession. Merz's CDU said in its campaign platform that it wanted a CAP that serves farmers. Scholz's centre-left government has made initiatives to support organic farming and reduce food waste, but it clashed with farmers over its decision a year ago to remove tax breaks on agricultural diesel. The CDU said it would reinstate the diesel tax break and take broader steps to strengthen planning security for farmers. The party said that, with the CDU, no farmer will ever again have to protest with his tractor in front of the Brandenburg Gate. Merz's chancellorship will mean that the conservative opposition will again be involved in Germany's famous debt brake. The brake limits the government's annual deficit spending to 0.35% and is seen by many as the reason for the poor state of the country's infrastructure. Scholz's efforts to intervene in the brake led to the collapse of his government, and Merz's CDU faction is strongly opposed to any reforms. Surprisingly, Merz himself hinted in a television debate earlier this month that he is open to some tweaks, but not before other solutions have been tried. Otherwise, financial markets are generally sceptical that Merz can do much to halt Germany's well-documented economic decline, with gross domestic product expected to contract by 0.5% in 2025. During the race, the choice between the two parties' economic policies was ultimately superficial. ING global head of macro Carsten Brzezinski lamented in a note earlier this month, noting that Merz's plans for tax and spending cuts reflected an almost spiritual faith in free markets. Merz will also have a critical influence on the outcome of a major transnational banking war that could test EU ideals. When Milanese lender UniCredit made a surprise bid for Germany's Commerzbank last year, it looked exactly the kind of cross-border banking consolidation Mario Draghi advocated in his seminal report, until Scholz's government reacted with horror and devised crazy plans to prevent it. UniCredit CEO Andrea Orcel has since said he would wait for Merz's position before making another move, but it is hard to imagine that the new leader would be more willing to give up one of the country's most valuable lenders. Merz holds the keys to significantly boosting Europe's defence capabilities in the coming years. As Trump pressures Europe to increase military spending, many in Brussels are anxiously awaiting Germany's approval for the European Commission to borrow money on behalf of member states. Over-indebted countries such as France, Italy and Spain, which have failed to meet NATO's defence spending target, argue that getting free money from Brussels is the only way to dramatically increase military spending without making politically unpopular cuts in other budget areas. Merz warmed to the idea during the election campaign, and his supporters hope his backing will overcome opposition from frugal allies like Austria and the Netherlands. There are many less controversial ideas on the table, such as exempting defence from EU spending rules or increasing military funding in the EU's new multi-annual budget, which comes into force in 2028. But supporters of the common debt argue that none of these alone would be enough to meet the scale of the challenge. As a result, Germany went to the polls amid multi-layered and strategically important developments in foreign policy. Dynamics such as the Ukraine-Russia war, the Trump administration's pressures on Europe and Germany, economic relations with China, and European security will be the main factors determining Berlin's roadmap after the elections. Germany's decisions in this process will be decisive not only at the national level, but also for the future of Europe and the global system. Therefore, the results of the elections are of great importance, not only for Germany's domestic politics, but also for international relations. Thank you for following us.